Hi everyone, good to see you on my channel today. Today I will tell you a wonderful story. It is full of love and kindness. I hope you enjoy it and I wish you an enjoyable viewing experience. Thank you.
Amanda waited impatiently for her husband's return, every now and then casting a reproachful glance at the hands of the wall clock. Well, where is he? He should have been here by now, and he's still not here, Megan thought wistfully and looked out the window again. No one. He's delayed. What if something happened on the road? Sebastian always drives himself, doesn't he? The car, though new, anything could happen, wouldn't keep you safe from everything. In her mind, Amanda considered even the most ridiculous theories, such as roadside robbery or bad weather. Anxiety had increased noticeably. Normally, Sebastian was more or less punctual, but today it was as if he'd been replaced. No answer to phone calls, dropping them. Can't you pick up the phone and reassure me that everything is fine? I'll be there soon. But no, there's no time. Dinner was already on the table. Amanda always cooked heartily, her favorite roast, browned meat with a crust, boiled potatoes with butter and dill, several kinds of salads, and a bottle of dry wine chilled in the fridge to just the right temperature and a fruit platter. Amanda spent a lot of time to please her spouse from the road. After all, hungry, tired, business trip is not easy. Partners with claims long fogged his head, postponed the time of negotiations then on Monday, then on Wednesday, and also, according to the husband, could not immediately decide on the place of the meeting, considering both a restaurant and a country cottage. Strange they are some kind. Although where do I judge about it? He has his own business, and I work in a bookshop, Amanda thought at the time. Dusk was already gently descending over the town. When the car pulled up in front of the house, Amanda's heart raced with joy. Here she was finally waiting. A blush broke out on her cheeks and a mysterious gleam appeared in her eyes. What a good feeling it is when you meet someone you've been waiting for so long for days. Even your heart beat in a special way, bringing a sweet smile to your lips. Amanda hurried to the door to meet her husband on the doorstep. The click of the lock. And there she was on the porch, ready to throw herself into his arms. But instead of her husband, there stood a young woman of about 25, who looked defiantly into the eyes of the lady of the house. Amanda was taken aback. She had expected to see anything but this. Had Sebastian really decided to bring guests into the house, and at night? It all seemed suspicious and out of character with Sebastian's routine. Amanda looked at her husband and saw a smile on his lips. It was not the smile of a man who missed his wife and was glad to see her. Rather, it was a grin, the kind of arrogant grin that arrogant people have. It was the first time Amanda had seen her husband like that. She didn't know what to say. Meanwhile, the stranger was the first to break the long pause. "You have a nice little house, Sebastian," she said. "I see you haven't been wasting your time. What a mansion you've built." "Actually, we bought it together with the money we got for our wedding." Amanda couldn't help herself. The stranger grinned and defiantly took Sebastian's hand. "So, sweetheart, are you going to tell me straight away? Honestly, I'm getting tired of this visual duel." At the same moment, Amanda realized that the stranger standing on the porch was not a guest or even Sebastian's colleague. It was his mistress standing in front of her. Who else could it be? How could a colleague just take her boss's hand like that and call him Sebastian like a cat in love? Amanda's mind went blank as Sebastian pushed her unceremoniously away with his shoulder and walked into the house, leading his companion with him. It all seemed somehow unreal, as if it were not happening to her. But on the stage of a theater they had once gone to together. Standing still, not understanding what was happening, Amanda decided to find out here and now. "What is this? Why is this woman acting so defiant and bossy, walking into our house uninvited?" Sebastian turned around and looked at her with a mocking look. "Haven't you figured that out yet? Megan is now my new wife, and you need to leave our house as soon as possible," he pronounced. Amanda's cheeks flushed and her lips trembled treacherously. "Why should I leave my house? It was bought with my parents' money too. Have you all lost your minds?" Sebastian sighed naively, making it clear that he was very uncomfortable with this conversation. At this point, he was acting as if he was talking to a small child, not his own wife. Megan is pregnant by me. I think that now the issue is over. And naturally, my child, I cannot leave without help and housing. And since you could not give me such a joy, sorry move, her husband hissed contemptuously. Tears glistened in Amanda's eyes. She wanted to scream and be hysterical. She wanted to pinch her arm and realize it was all just a dream. She'd been so tired all day that she hadn't even noticed how she'd fallen asleep in the kitchen in the cozy armchair. Now she would open her eyes and see that nothing terrible had happened. Her husband is patiently waiting for her to wake up and go to dinner with him. But reality was not going anywhere. Sebastian was still smiling ridiculously and holding the hand of his mistress, who was expecting a child with him. The shock of the news was so intense that for a while Amanda lost all ability to resist. It was like when a cornered animal becomes frozen for a moment in front of a predator, which later costs it its life. Amanda even assumed it was all just a stupid prank. Sebastian always liked to joke, but never had his joke sounded so unpleasant and absurd. "How long are you going to stand there? You've been told clearly, pack your things, move out. Me and Sebastian and I are going to live here now," Megan said, giving Amanda a scornful look. Naturally, the deceived wife was not going to give up so easily. Why on earth would she give up the house she had lived in for 4 years? Of course, Amanda knew exactly what this beauty had done to Sebastian. Childlessness had always been a sore subject with her. Everywhere they did not turn, where they did not undergo treatment, but everything turned out in vain. From time to time, her husband voiced his dissatisfaction. It was evident from his attitude. But on the other hand, the same problem is faced by 1,000,000 families in the world. However, not everyone brings a pregnant mistress into the house to kick out the lawful wife. "Well, Amanda, that cleared it up. I know that after your parents' house burned down, you will have nowhere to live. That's why I've taken care of it. My mother lives in the village of Riverside, so you can stay with her. I've already made the arrangements, and she's fine with it. I got you a bus ticket, 2 window seat, comfy. By the way, the bus leaves in an hour and a half. So if you hurry, you can make it," Sebastian said mundanely. Amanda's breath caught in her throat with indignation. Had her life already been mapped out for her, and had even chosen a place for her to go to heal her wounds? And how does he imagine it? After all, Amanda had never met his mother. At one point, she thought the woman was dead. And then it turns out that Sebastian is going to send her there in exile to keep her out of the way and out of the way of a happy relationship. "And if I refuse?" Amanda asked in a trembling voice. Her husband grinned. "Well, that's up to you. Except that as of today, you don't have a job anymore. I spoke to your boss and he's already decided to find another salesman. I also bought back the debt you've been paying for months. Yeah, the one for the books that were ruined by a faulty heating pipe. The debt was pinned on you. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Well, I did some checking, and I knew what was what. You agreed with the shopkeeper that you'd pay a little from each salary. But now I've bought it all back. I'll use your receipt in case of trouble. I'd advise you not to play with fire and get out of here fast," Sebastian said. Amanda stood there and couldn't believe her ears. Was all this really happening to her? The indifferent, cold voice and the scornful look of his mistress, who was already counting the minutes until his wife left the house. And was all this really happening now? After all, just yesterday everything was so good. She was looking forward to her husband's return from a business trip and thinking about what dish to cook and what dress to wear. And now everything is ruined. But there must be an explanation for everything. Especially if this person says she's pregnant, it means they've seen each other several times. If she had been more attentive and less trusting of people, she would have noticed changes in her husband's mood, smelled a woman's perfume. But what was the use of thinking about it when the past was gone? Losing all resolve, Amanda went to her room to pack her things. And it wasn't because of the threats, which sounded naive, to say the least. It was the betrayal of being used and discarded like a worthless thing. But what could Amanda do? Make a scandal with breaking crockery? And would that really make a difference? Or would the mistress suddenly vanish into thin air? Or maybe Sebastian would fall to his knees in front of Amanda and beg, "Do not execute. Let me speak, my queen." Of course, none of that would happen. As she packed her things, Amanda had little idea of what awaited her in the village. In fact, she had never seen Sebastian's mother in person or in a photograph. What's to say, she didn't even know her name. Amanda knew from anecdotal evidence that he had once had a serious conflict with his mother, which had caused him to leave her and move to the city. 15 years had passed since then, changing Sebastian's life beyond recognition. He acquired a superior voice, posture, acquired the right acquaintances, and easily operated with business phrases, as if he was born in the business elite. Once he had been the son of an ordinary tractor driver and a female paramedic who worked in the village medical center. Now not everyone can recognize Sebastian as a villager. Expensive suit, tie, branded shirt, as well as fashionable shoes, clean to a mirror shine, elite toilet water, and luxury watches from a manufacturer of world renown, as well as a smartphone, which is the dream of good half of the world. Deep down, Amanda still couldn't understand why Sebastian hadn't taken her mum into town. Perhaps he was just ashamed of her simple origin. But he wasn't far behind either in his school days. He'd grazed cows in the pasture with the boys and splashed in the muddy pond. "What's taking you so long to get ready?" "The taxi will be here soon. I'm not taking you to the bus station, you know, so you'll figure it out. I've got the ticket, the flight's listed. Anyway, have a safe journey. Oh, and you'll get your divorce notice in the post. I'll send it to your mother. And when you get there, ask for Mrs. Beatrice. You got it. Every dog in the place knows her. Say hello to her, too," Sebastian muttered. Amanda shrieked softly and picked up the suitcase. Packing in this state was difficult. In a way, it was like a panicked person trying to get the most valuable things out of a burning house. Thinking logically in such a case is unreal. Everything is confused in the head, clinging to one thing over another and making it hard to concentrate. Tears were pouring from her eyes in a steady stream. Amanda mentally scolded herself for her weakness and docile character. If her partner Chloe had been in her place, she would have slapped the pretty girl and then scratched Sebastian's eyes out. Amanda wasn't like that, gentle, calm, kind, and impressionable. That set of personal qualities might even seem like a good thing, but to Amanda, it brought nothing but misery. Life is such a thing, when sometimes you need to show character, if only to defend your honor. Only now Amanda was unable to fight back against her husband and his pregnant girlfriend. From the outside, it was more like running away from herself to nowhere. Soon a taxi pulled up, and Sebastian briskly loaded Amanda's suitcase into it, slipped the taxi driver a crumpled piece of paper, and asked him to go faster. The driver, a quick guy, realized what was going on and pressed the accelerator to the floor. Amanda herself acted as if in a dream. When she got off at the bus station, she couldn't find the right flight for a long time, wandering around the area, which was filled with several dozen cars. Fortunately, she was helped by one of the chauffeurs who took pity on the crying woman and, taking her suitcase from her hands, checked her ticket. "Oh, so this is my flight, and I was wondering why I was the one with an empty seat," the driver said. Amanda smiled faintly, though she didn't really want to smile. Why would this nice man want to know the real reason for her upset? Let it all stay in the back of her mind. The bus ride at night was comfortable. The heat of the day had subsided, and the motorway was half empty. Leaning her heated forehead against the window, Amanda indifferently watched the forests. Endless fields and small bodies of water passed by. Her mood was simply disgusting. Understanding her condition, the driver was watching the road with a deliberately attentive look. The man realized that sometimes in life there are such accidents when only he himself can help a person. Amanda arrived at the desired settlement only in the morning. The air smelled fresh, and the village roosters were just beginning to clear their throats. At one point she dozed off and almost missed her stop. The driver leaned over and gently touched her shoulder. "That's it, here we are, your station." Amanda flinched and, through a forced smile, thanked him. A minute later, the chauffeur helped her to take her suitcase from the luggage compartment and even waved goodbye. Amanda felt a little sad. The village stretched along the road, looking like an elongated cylinder. She was visibly confused by the fact that she didn't even know the right house number. After all, Sebastian didn't remember it either. Perhaps he was just pretending to do it on purpose to make Amanda nervous and once again realize her dependence on him. and her unenviable position. Amanda walked through the village, holding a bulky suitcase in her hand. She couldn't remember what was in it, because she threw everything into it. At one point, Amanda thought she might have thrown in some warm clothes, and considering that it was the middle of summer, it looked ridiculous. Soon a disgruntled mooing could be heard from the end of the street. She spotted a herd of cows being chased by an elderly shepherd with a long, worn leather whip. The man was dressed like most shepherds around the world. Old canvas trousers, stubby boots, something like a jacket or a frayed jacket over his shoulders. On his head he wore a trademark cap from the days when they sang about something soulful and native. Amanda had never seen cows so close before. It's only on TV that they seem nice and safe. But here, a bull swings his horns and it's the end. The bull walked past with a haughty look, noisily sucking in air and kicking up dust with his hooves. Amanda noticed that there was a ring threaded through his nose. She had once heard that it was used to subdue violent animals if they decided to show off their strength. The cows passed by indifferently, like an endless brown and white avalanche. At last she came upon a shepherd, who raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Who are you here to see, and at this early hour?" Amanda shrugged her shoulders in embarrassment. "You see, I'm looking for Mrs. Beatrice. I hear she's your paramedic." The shepherd squinted at the stranger. The man looked to be in his 50s or 70s. His wispy beard and thick uncut hair falling over his wrinkled forehead made it hard to tell. "Mrs. Beatrice, you say? Well, we know her, don't we? Her house is at the end of the street, where I drove the cows out just now. See?" Amanda looked in the direction indicated and at once spotted a small house with greenery. The iron sheets on the roof had rusted through from time. "That's where she lives. Don't ring the bell, it doesn't work. You'd better knock, she has a reliable dog. He'll hear you and bring you up at once. Are you a niece or distant relative of hers?" Amanda coughed embarrassedly, then said that Mrs. Beatrice was her third aunt. The forced lie didn't come easily. In fact, she wanted to tell the truth, but for some reason her tongue decided that such an answer would suffice. Amanda didn't really want to start her acquaintance with deception. From the way everyone in the village treated Mrs. Beatrice, she was a good person, and it's no wonder her son had lost his temper. Who doesn't? She thought she knew Sebastian like the back of her hand, but he'd surprised her so much that Amanda was still reeling. Thanking the shepherd for his help, she picked up her suitcase and walked towards the house she needed. Some of the locals were already awake and had gone out into the courtyard to enjoy the morning chill. They shook their heads in amazement at the stranger and wondered who it was that had come to their countryside. The exodus of young people from the village had been so strong lately that it was almost unreal to see a young woman with a suitcase as a visitor. At last Amanda stopped at the wicket gate of the house. Remembering that the bell did not work, she knocked distinctly on the wooden door. At the same time, she heard the barking of the chained dog. The polecat was a good guardian and had heard Amanda's approach in advance, but he did not bark, so as not to disturb her, but waited patiently for Amanda to break the silence first. Amanda felt like a schoolgirl in her first class, awkwardly awaiting the conversation. A moment later, the door opened and a pale, thin woman appeared on the doorstep, wearing old horn-rimmed glasses on her nose. "Well, who else is here this early? I told you I don't do home visits, only at the nurse's station. I'm not a midwife, not a fortune teller, but still a medical worker. If anything, your prejudices don't mean anything to me." Amanda was confused by the surprise, and holding her suitcase in her hands, didn't know what to say. The hostess gave her guest an appraising glance, smiled and motioned for her to come in. "Look, I'm sorry, of course, but I have a serious conversation to have with you." Amanda stumbled back before she could even greet the lady of the house. Mrs. Beatrice shook her head. "I know you have a conversation. I don't just have people coming to see me. If you've come home, you must have a need. But I'm warning you right away, if you have, I don't deal with it." Mrs. Beatrice's words sent Amanda into a fever. She immediately started to justify herself and said that she had not come for that reason, and that she loved children and would never have decided to abort. Mrs. Beatrice looked at her guest with a smile. "That you love children is a good thing, but there are all sorts of things in life. I love children too, I'm always happy when a woman is pregnant. It's happiness." The words of Sebastian's mother made Amanda's chest throb. The way she talked about motherhood made her envious. Meanwhile, Mrs. Beatrice had put the old kettle on the stove and was fussing in the kitchen to feed her guest. The most interesting thing was that the hostess did not hurry with questions, but waited patiently for Amanda to tell the purpose of her visit. Whether Mrs. Beatrice had any idea that she was her daughter-in-law, Amanda did not know. Sebastian was hardly sentimental enough to send his mother a photograph of his fiancée. The house was cozy, smelling of herbs or cinnamon or something else that wasn't familiar to Amanda. "Well, let's have some tea first, then we can talk about the serious stuff," the woman said with a smile, and then went into a fit of a choking cough. And it was summer. Where did she get such a cold in her lungs? Amanda felt embarrassed by her words. In a way, she felt guilty that Sebastian had abandoned this sweet woman to her fate and had run away to the city to follow his dream of becoming rich. She sat down at the table. Mrs. Beatrice sipped her tea and then said, "You don't mind me at all. Even though I said I don't do home visits. I'm not. I can't refuse help. I help as much as I can. I used to work as a paramedic in an ambulance station. I liked everything about it. But as I got older, I realized I needed to find something closer to home. And just then the local council organized a medical center. It's a long way into town. Not everyone has a car." Amanda nodded in agreement. She found herself liking Mrs. Beatrice more and more. She was also completely different from Sebastian, who thought very differently and was used to dividing people into rich and poor. For Mrs. Beatrice, however, everyone was equal, no matter who came to her for help. She always tried to do her best to alleviate the patient's suffering. Gaining some air in her chest, Amanda got to the main point. "Mrs. Beatrice, I'm sorry I didn't tell you right away. Here's the thing. I'm your son's wife. I'm your son's ex-wife. Well, a divorce is imminent." The confession was not easy. Her lips trembled, sweat beaded on her forehead. The landlady looked at her in surprise, then waved her hand at the running tears. "So this is what Sebastian sent word to me, and he couldn't come himself." Amanda lowered her eyes in embarrassment. "He couldn't, Mrs. Beatrice. I wasn't even planning on coming at all. It just happened. You see." The landlady shook her head. "I see what I don't understand. My Sebastian must have thrown you out. I'm not surprised at all. He has nothing sacred left in his soul." A salty tear rolled down Amanda's cheek. If someone had told her that she would sit at the table with her mother-in-law and talk about her husband's betrayal, she would never have believed it. And how can you believe, when before they had everything was fine, up to the moment when he appeared on the doorstep with his mistress, and for good reason he told her he was going to be a father. And now Amanda had nothing more to do here. At that moment, the words came pouring out of her. She went on and on, telling Mrs. Beatrice how they had met, how she had believed his tales of family happiness and had given her heart without a shadow of doubt. She listened in silence, hardly interrupting. At times her face grew gloomy, and the wrinkles in her forehead told that she was now thinking painfully about something. Of course, like any normal mother, she hated to hear that her son had turned out to be such a scoundrel and betrayed the woman who loved him. On the other hand, Sebastian had once betrayed her as well, running away from home at the worst possible moment. After listening to the story, Mrs. Beatrice coughed again, but this time the attack was shorter. "I understand you, but coming to see me was the right thing to do. People are very different here in the country, and mental wounds heal much more quickly than in the city. If you stay here for a week, you'll calm down. I'm telling you this not only as a doctor, but also as a human being. I'll help you with a job if you need it. You'll be my assistant at the nurse's station." Amanda looked at Mrs. Beatrice in surprise. "An assistant? I've never been involved in medicine. I don't know how things are done. Injections, drips. I don't think I could do it." The landlady grinned. "Don't worry, I'll help you. Show you everything. Teach you everything. Injections and drips. Don't be afraid. There's nothing complicated about it. Although the base will have to learn. But you'll always have something to do, and you won't have time to be sad." Amanda looked at Mrs. Beatrice with gratitude. She was a good woman. She'd listened to her and taken her in. She could have thrown her ungrateful son out of the house. But Mrs. Beatrice didn't. Not only that, she offered her help, a place to live and a job. Amanda didn't hesitate long, and there was no choice. She could, of course, go back to the city and look for rented accommodation. But after Sebastian's threats, she didn't want to do that. When she heard her guest answer in the affirmative, Mrs. Beatrice remarked, "Well, that's settled. Then we shall work together. In the meantime, I suggest you rest after your journey and come to your senses. Today I'll conduct the reception myself, and you see what's what. Gain strength. There'll be a lot of work in the future. People are coming here from all the surrounding villages. No one wants to go to the city. People there are mean, they all want money. But in the village it is much easier, and the payments are in cash." Amanda looked at her hostess with a smile, pleased that she had been welcomed so warmly. Of course, Sebastian's betrayal hadn't gone away, and it still hurt. But he lived far away now. There were two deceived, abandoned women, a mother and a wife. But in a way they became friends in misfortune, having experienced the same emotions at different times. Soon Mrs. Beatrice began to get ready for work. But before she did, she quickly showed Amanda around the house and assigned a room. It had a bed with a sprung mattress, a small table, a wardrobe, and a couple of chairs. There was even a small television that stood in the corner like an aquarium. "That's it. I'm off. Make yourself comfortable, Amanda. Make yourself at home," she said and closed the door, coughing again. As it turned out, the infirmary was about 100 meters from the house. Deciding to see Mrs. Beatrice off, Amanda followed, but the woman insisted she stay. "If you get bored, come and see me. But first rest and rest again. You see the crowd of people standing at the door of the little house. That's where I keep the reception, so to speak, until the last client. Sometimes they even come from faraway villages in the evening. And if I cannot help, I give a referral to the regional hospital, where the patient will definitely help. Anyway, don't see me off. We're not saying goodbye." Amanda smiled and waved goodbye. To her great relief, the meeting had gone as well as it could, and she had been dreading this conversation. In Amanda's opinion, her mother-in-law had nothing in common with her son except blood relation. Even their personalities were different. If Mrs. Beatrice sought to help everyone, Sebastian thought only of himself, never did anything for the common good. Despite the fact that Mrs. Beatrice had asked her to rest, Amanda decided to clean the house. No, it didn't mean that the rooms were dirty at all. It was just a way for Amanda to do her part and thank Mrs. Beatrice a little for her hospitality. All the more reason to keep her mind occupied so she wouldn't go back to thoughts of cheating. With a broom in one hand and a brush in the other, Amanda set to work. The work was going well, and Amanda managed to distract herself for a while, forgetting about the betrayal. Mrs. Beatrice's house was old and dilapidated, and had not been renovated for a long time. But on the other hand, what was there to be surprised about? A single woman of her age could hardly make repairs alone without the help of her son. At that time, Sebastian was already literally drowning in luxury and could afford to hire a construction crew to make repairs to his mother's house, as well as clean the well and repair the fence. But Sebastian was vindictive and had not remitted a penny to his mother in all that time. He didn't even bother to send a birthday or New Year's card. Sebastian didn't come to her 60th birthday party either. Amanda then especially did not think about what is the matter, thought that her husband himself will understand the issues of family relations. And only now, looking at Mrs. Beatrice with different eyes, Amanda realized that, like this kind woman, she had fallen victim to her son's devious, deceptively kind nature. She decided to go out into the yard to inspect the homestead and perhaps weed the grass. She did not feel tired or sick from the long journey. She had probably had enough of those few hours of restless sleep on the bus to recover. Mrs. Beatrice's plot was relatively small, 10 or 12 acres. Amanda couldn't be more precise, as she didn't know much about it. Most of it was covered with fruit trees, apples, cherries, plums, and apricots. The ripe, juicy fruit fell to the ground with a pleasant crunch, attracting hordes of flies in search of sweetness. Suddenly, Amanda heard a strange noise on her right side. At first, she didn't realize that it was Polkan, who was sitting on a chain and didn't make a sound when Amanda appeared. Apparently, the clever dog realized that if the hostess accepted the guest as she should, then there was no need to bark at her in vain. Amanda looked round and noticed a strange shadow between the trees. She realized from its relatively short stature that it was probably a child. "Come here, don't be afraid," Amanda said gently. "Aren't you going to swear?" came a child's voice from deep within the bushes. She smiled. "Oh, no, I won't. Come on out. Don't worry, I won't hurt you. I'm not really the mistress of this house, but I don't think Mrs. Beatrice will mind." The little boy who had been sitting in the bushes hesitated for a moment, and then climbed out of the thicket, holding several large apples behind his back. At that moment, Amanda realized that this boy had probably taken advantage of his mistress's absence to climb into the garden to pick some fruit for himself. Who among us hasn't done that as a child, when everything seems accessible and there are no conventions or obligations? As he came closer, the boy frowned, expecting her to scold him for the stolen apples. But not only did Amanda not do that, she plucked another couple of juicy fruits off the branch and added to the ones she already had. "What's your name?" "I'm Amanda," she asked cautiously. The boy hesitated for a moment, as if working out in his mind whether it was okay to tell this aunt the truth, or whether it was better to hold off. "I'm Nicholas. Actually, I was sent here by the older boys. We're orphans, you know. They bring us fruit, it's true, but we still want apples in summer. So I took the train and came here. I've come here before, and always successfully. Today I got caught," the boy said sadly. Amanda looked at the little orphan with undisguised pity. Of course, she realized that he wanted fruit and had agreed to go into someone else's garden for that. But how could she accuse this little boy of stealing when he looked at her with such hope in his eyes? "Won't the orphanage miss you?" Amanda asked. Nicholas only waved his hand. "No, we have a new director now, so he doesn't care about us. He's thinking of ways to make money at our expense. That's what the older boys told me." Amanda looked at the boy in surprise. Deep down, she didn't really believe his words. After all, the idea that someone could profit at the expense of such little orphans, especially since they were already deprived of life, did not fit in her head. "Look, Nicholas, is it possible that it's just the imagination of the elders? I don't believe the headmaster is capable of such meanness." The boy squinted at her. "I didn't believe it at first either. I thought the boys were making it up on purpose. But then I saw Mr. Oliver loading crates of fruit into the car, and bags of cereal, bags of sugar. We're on a schedule, not a gram less and not a gram more. And recently sugar has disappeared completely. The tea isn't sweet, and the compote is a little better than water." Amanda shook her head disapprovingly. She realized that the orphans were unlikely to get justice alone, especially if they acted in secret. For a moment, she wanted to help Nicholas and his friends in such a difficult situation. But how to do it? She did not know yet, so she decided to wait for Mrs. Beatrice to return and consult her. Nicholas was about to leave when Amanda stopped him and suggested that he wait in the kitchen for the landlady. "What if she starts arguing? I realize I've done a bad thing. I stole apples. But the boys asked for them so much I couldn't refuse," Nicholas asked anxiously. "Don't you worry, it'll be all right. Mrs. Beatrice is very kind and I'm sure she won't scold you," Amanda argued. Nicholas nodded in agreement, although he didn't really trust the words of this strange aunt whose eyes were red with tears. Mrs. Beatrice didn't have to wait long. She came home during the lunch hour. When she saw the little guest at the table, she smiled. "Who's this here to see us? You must have come for apples. I noticed you a long time ago, but I pretended not to see you, so as not to scare you." Nicholas lowered his eyes in embarrassment. All this time, he'd thought he'd been masterfully fooling his hostess, when in fact she knew everything and only pretended not to notice. "Forgive me, I won't do it again," Nicholas whispered with difficulty holding back tears. Mrs. Beatrice walked over to him and put her hand on his shoulder. "Oh, don't you worry. Everything will be fine. Only you better tell me right away next time you come. I'll give you some good apples, and some apricots and pears too. I know life in the orphanage isn't easy." Yes, they say the headmaster also steals, Amanda remarked cautiously, relaying the information Nicholas had said. Mrs. Beatrice raised an eyebrow in surprise. Oh, really? Is that what it's like stealing from orphans so young? We must get to the bottom of this. Nicholas looked at the older woman doubtfully. In his heart, he did not believe that Mrs. Beatrice would be able to solve the problem of theft, because the older boys had already tried to write complaints and appeal to higher authorities. But nobody listened to them, and the anonymous letters they planted in the local authorities remained unheeded. After some thought, Mrs. Beatrice said, I'll go to Michael. He's a neighborhood officer. He'll probably be able to sort it out. If Michael doesn't help, we'll go all the way to the neighborhood. It's not the first time I've seen you round the local gardens. People complain they try to let the dogs down. I feel sorry for the children. They're the flowers of life. If you don't water them, they'll grow weeds like my son. Amanda looked sadly at Mrs. Beatrice. The last thing she wanted right now was to be reminded of sad things. No matter how hard she looked at it, Sebastian had betrayed her, abandoned her years ago. They poured tea for themselves, Amanda and Nicholas. Mrs. Beatrice Mace thought for a moment. Her face remained impenetrable, and her guests could only guess what she was thinking. At last, the hostess was the first to break the lingering pause. You probably don't know, Amanda. Sebastian wasn't a native. I adopted him so he wouldn't end up in an orphanage. We got called to a car accident one day, so I got there. When I saw it, I nearly fainted. The woman behind the wheel was dying, and she was pregnant. What was I supposed to do? I had to induce labor and save the baby. How could I know that later the husband of the deceased will refuse the child, considering him the culprit of the tragedy? I begged and pleaded with him for a long time. I almost got on my knees, only if he would not give the baby to the baby house. Then I consulted Harold and decided to take custody, and that's how Sebastian became my son. I didn't tell him that he was adopted until after high school. It came out by accident when he went into the wardrobe and found the adoption papers. Tears glistened in Amanda's eyes, and Sebastian still had the conscience to betray this saintly woman. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Beatrice, he'd be living in the middle of nowhere, maybe even in prison, having lost his way. As she said this, Mrs. Beatrice suddenly coughed again and put her palm to her mouth. The cough was heavy and was clearly causing her great discomfort. Is it bad? Amanda exclaimed anxiously, trying to help, but the woman only withdrew her hand and shook her head. Oh no, Amanda. Nothing can help me anymore. My tumor is inoperable, do you understand? I've known about it for a long time, but I've been trying to fight it, collecting herbs and drinking potions. I'm a medical worker myself, but I still believe in the power of traditional medicine. But it all turned out to be useless. The doctor says that I don't have long to live. Nicholas, who was sitting at the table, immediately became quiet and looked anxiously at the old woman. At that moment, he felt particularly ashamed of stealing apples from her. And Amanda looked at Mrs. Beatrice with completely different eyes. It turned out that this terminally ill woman continued to work at the nurse's station to help those who needed it. In fact, she could have given up and dealt only with her own health, which had been undermined by years of hard work. When Mrs. Beatrice finally coughed and removed the handkerchief, Amanda noticed the droplets of blood that were barely visible on its snow-white surface. Amanda's heart clenched. The sight of her sick mistress finally upset her and made her look at the situation with different eyes. Sebastian hadn't even realized that his mother was terminally ill and that she didn't have long to live. She also understood the unnaturally pale face of Mrs. Beatrice, who had met her early that morning. She had been so confident in her conversation that at first she had not even suspected her health. Meanwhile, the mother-in-law began to question Nicholas carefully about what was happening at the orphanage. The boy answered reluctantly, as if afraid of judgment. But then he got the hang of it and told it like it was. As it turned out, Mr. Oliver took up his position about 6 months ago and immediately turned around by selling products from the orphanage to local shops. The cunning businessman was methodically enriching himself at an astonishing rate. At the mere mention of such injustice, Mrs. Beatrice felt uneasy. After a moment's thought, she took out an old push-button telephone from her pocket and dialed the number of the police officer, to whom she immediately described the situation in detail. Michael had been on the job for about 3 years and had proved himself to be a principled crime fighter who did not compromise his conscience or take bribes. The young police officer asked Mrs. Beatrice to send the boy with someone to his department, but since she herself had a job ahead of her, Amanda volunteered to drive Nicholas. The boy breathed a sigh of relief, for he had been so afraid of talking to a policeman who might scold him for raiding his neighbor's gardens. On the way to Michael's, Nicholas and Amanda got to talking and chattering away. Both of them were in a better mood. After all, they now knew that the cunning director of the orphanage would have problems that no amount of money could solve. At this very moment, many kilometers away from this place, Sebastian and his mistress were in the office of a notary, who told them some very interesting news. It turned out that a will had been drawn up in Sebastian's name, in which he was the sole heir. As it turned out, for a long time Mrs. Beatrice had been saving money from her pension and salary to a secret bank account, without withdrawing interest, so that the amount would increase every year. By the day the will was made, there was quite a lot lying in the bank account. In the greedy Sebastian's mind, this was a true gift of fate. I didn't know Mom was so frugal. Look how much she's saved up. Oh, I wish I could inherit. I'd put that money into circulation right away, Sebastian thought dreamily. The notary looked at the businessman reproachfully. It was about his mother after all. Look, Mr. Scott, do you know how long my mother's left? A month, 2 months, so that I can prepare for the inheritance? Sebastian inquired cautiously. The notary gloomed. Well, how can I tell you, young man? I'm not the Lord God. I found out about this by chance, and so I thought I'd share it. Honestly, I didn't even realize you two were related. At first I thought you were namesakes. Sebastian grinned meaningfully and looked at his mistress, a smug smile sliding across her face. The sum Sebastian had promised her was just enough to buy her a brand new car. Well, a mother wouldn't carry her child in her arms. It's a bygone age. Now all mums drive their own cars, and they drive cars that you can't get enough of. Meanwhile, Michael briefly questioned Nicholas and entered all the information into the report. This was done with the expectation that the case would become official. Well, I think your Mr. Oliver can be brought to justice now, the policeman said with a polite smile. As she shook hands with Nicholas and Amanda, touching his strong, masculine palm, Amanda felt an inexplicable sympathy, which she experienced on a subconscious level. Nicholas did not want to return to the orphanage, but he could not stay away for more than 2 days. The carers were already used to the fact that children from time to time run away. But if they are absent for a long time, they are forced to search for them, which is fraught with consequences for the runaways themselves. But Mrs. Beatrice, after talking to Amanda, decided to redo the will. And as an heir this time, the old woman was going to specify her daughter-in-law. Considering her a victim of circumstances and feeling guilty for her negligent son, Mrs. Beatrice wanted to bring peace and comfort into her life. In her heart, her mother had long since forgiven Sebastian for the way he had run away from home, leaving her with an ailing father who had suffered a stroke, ruined by the annual harvest battles. Harold passed away very early in life, never seeing his son married. Thus, even before she met Amanda, Mrs. Beatrice had made a will for her son anyway, for she had no other relatives. But when her daughter-in-law told her how he had turned into a real scoundrel, she decided to disinherit him, making changes to the will at the request of the client. The notary felt that he was doing something right and necessary. After all, if evil always wins in life, there will be real chaos. After Nicholas's appeal to the police, Mr. Oliver began to have serious problems, and calls to the police and prosecutor's office did not take long. At first, the experienced businessman tried to use his connections so that the intractable district officer was removed from the case. But Michael has not in vain worked in the police for so long to give in to provocations from a high-ranking thief. The most interesting thing turned out a little later, when the traces of Mr. Oliver led to the businessman Sebastian, who helped the director of the orphanage to sell stolen products in the network of his shops. The news had been sobering for both Amanda and Mrs. Beatrice, who still doubted whether Sebastian should be completely disinherited. But when her son appeared to her in such an unsavory light, the mother realized that there could be no excuse for the scoundrel. 3 months after the investigation began, Mr. Oliver and his accomplice Sebastian were brought to justice. Of course, the businessman, who helped to sell stolen products, did not get a big sentence, because the main blame lay still on the director, who, taking advantage of his position, robbed the poor orphans. The news that his mother had changed her will at the very last moment was an even greater blow to Sebastian. Little did he know that Sebastian had actually been counting on the money, intending to use it for bribes to keep the case out of court. Now that Sebastian had lost his former opportunities and acquaintances, he realized that it had all started with Amanda, whom he had so despicably thrown out of the house at the whim of his pregnant mistress. But the series of shocking news did not end there. Megan, who was not actually pregnant and simply took advantage of the gullibility of a businessman in love, contributed her share of negativity. "What's the big deal?" "Nothing personal," she said as she left the courtroom. When Amanda found out, she wasn't surprised at all. There was nothing special about it. After all, if a person behaves unfairly to his or her loved ones, one day he or she will become a victim of deceit. Amanda did not worry about it and filed for divorce a month before the trial. She was also going to complete a nursing course so that she could fill in for Mrs. Beatrice at work if necessary. The elderly female paramedic began calling Amanda her daughter. Amanda persuaded her to get a course of treatment with that big money rather than spend it on some inheritance. Sebastian's mom also dreamed of marrying Amanda off to Michael, the neighborhood policeman, who appeared to have taken a liking to her at first sight. After her mistake with Sebastian, the divorced woman was in no hurry to make a decision. First of all, she wanted to take custody of little Nicholas, who, having achieved the removal of the director of the children's home, later longed for a family of his own. When the Board of Guardians expressed doubts about Amanda's ability to raise the boy alone, the same Michael came to her aid, stating in front of everyone that it was his legal spouse. At first, Amanda thought it was all a joke, and going out on the street, she thought Michael would take it back. To her great surprise, that didn't happen. Michael was indeed a man of his word. Nicholas, who was just waiting for the moment to be adopted so he could play cop in his daddy's uniform, was most excited about it. It didn't take long for the wedding to take place, and 6 months later, everyone was already shouting happily. Bitter. A mother of many children takes a job with a fading millionaire widower, and barely had she sat down at the piano. Marian looked at the note for what must have been the 10th time, rereading it. No, the handwriting was legible, but the content. Marian, I'm sorry, but I can't go on like this. I've fallen in love with another woman, and today she and I are leaving for another city. Don't look for us. Tell the children I love them. Matthew. She slowly sat back in her chair and waved the note away, as if that little scrap of paper could provide some kind of coolness. It just can't be. Marian muttered quietly. No, she'd noticed something strange going on with Matthew lately. She had noticed it, but she didn't want to believe it. It was true what they said about a husband cheating the wife would be the last to know. He told her he was working hard, that he was tired, that he was working late, that he was going out in the evenings and weekends. Even the kids seemed to have begun to suspect something. At least the eldest, Stephen, he's 14 now. Marian, at his age, would probably realize by now that her mom and dad don't like each other and are only together because they have nowhere to live separately. Of course, in front of the children, Marian pretended that everything was fine. Daddy just works hard, she answered all their questions and smiled, trying to make it look believable. He does it for us. She saw Stephen frown incredulously. He hadn't asked his mother anything, perhaps because he didn't want to bother his younger brother and sister. Or maybe he thought the adults would figure it out for themselves. Suspicions had plagued Marian for a long time. She tried to ignore them as best she could. Her blonde, long hair stuck to the front passenger seat of her husband's car. Though Marian's was dark walnut-colored and long past her shoulders, she wouldn't let it go. Long hair isn't practical when you have 3 kids. Just giving a lift to one of his colleagues, she thought. Was Marian thinking about hair or acquaintances? The smell of someone else's sweet feminine perfume from his clothes, The sound of a text message arriving on his phone at 2 a.m. Matthew, who'd been going to the bathroom for an hour at a time just to go have a beer with his friends. And his friends who hid their eyes if they happened to run into Marian. All of this she found an explanation for. Why, she thought, clutching the note in her hands. Why did I make excuses for him when it was so obvious? Just because I was used to trusting him? Or because I've never cheated anyone myself? In 15 years of marriage, Marian had never once lied to Matthew, even about the smallest things. Or maybe she was just afraid of ruining their stable, steady world she'd grown so accustomed to over the years. Don't wake trouble while it's quiet, Marian's grandmother was fond of saying. Marian didn't wake her up, just pretended everything was the same as before, until he decided to make the first move. "Mum, are we having dinner tonight?" Stephen came into the kitchen. He had always picked up her moods like radar, and now he knew at once that something was wrong with his mother. Marian twitched, tried to hide the note, but the son jumped to her in 2 steps, practically pulled the paper from his mother's hands, read it in a couple of seconds, sighed in a mature way, without surprise, as if he had long been prepared that such a thing could happen. "I see. Have you called him yet?" "Why?" "What do you mean, why?" The eldest son sat down next to me. Of all the children, he was the most like Marian, the same dark hazel hair, expressive green eyes and straight, neat nose. But unlike the soft Marian, Stephen was serious and sensible from childhood, as if he was preparing for the fact that he would have to become the head of the family. "We'll have to discuss divorce, alimony. Who will pay for the flat? We have a mortgage for another 5 years. You're probably right. We should just talk to him about it. I just don't believe it's real yet." His son sighed and put his hand over hers. "I know it's very difficult for you right now, Mum, but you and I both knew this was going to happen at some point. How long has he been cheating on you? 3 years? 5 years? Marian flinched as if struck by a blow. "I don't know. Let's not talk about it. You'd better call the younger ones. We must have supper." Stephen got up. "I'll get them." "You're not going to tell them yet?" "No. I'll contact your father first." Marian threw the note into the rubbish bin. Matthew didn't answer his phone or text messages. Marian even called him at work. They said Matthew had tendered his resignation a few days earlier, and they never saw him again. Marian also called some of his friends. They replied that they didn't know anything either. Only one of the mates, Alex, said that Matthew had told him about his plans to leave his wife and kids and run off with his mistress. "I thought he was joking," Alex sighed. It turned out to be a joke. "You knew Matthew was cheating on me, didn't you?" Marian asked. There was silence in the phone for a few seconds, but then Alex answered. "Yes." "Okay," said Marian. "I understand. Thanks for telling me everything." She finished the calls, looked thoughtfully out the window. The children were already asleep, and now she had time to think and decide what to do next. After Molly, their youngest daughter, had been born 7 years ago, it was clear that Marian wouldn't be working for a long time. "And what are you going to do there?" her husband said then. "Even if you worked double shifts at your hospital, your salary wouldn't even be enough for 1 child, let alone 3. Marian sighed. She realized that nurses weren't paid that much. "Quit," Matthew continued. "Take care of the house and the children, and we'll have enough money." So she listened to her husband and resigned from the hospital where she had worked for many years. Of course, they were very upset. There was already a shortage of nurses, and there were very few responsible and careful professionals like Marian. She didn't really want to quit. She enjoyed her work, but it was difficult to combine it with caring for her husband and children. After she was fired, Marian didn't know where to put herself for the first time. She was used to being torn between her shifts, her husband, her children, and household chores. Only maternity leave was a rest for her, but only from work, because the rest of her duties were not canceled. Now she could take Molly and Alex to nursery in the morning and Stephen to school. On the way back, she had to go grocery shopping, then do the dishes, put the toys away, throw things in the wash, sweep and mop the floors. And then it was time to make lunch so that by the time it was ready, she could run to pick up the younger ones from kindergarten. Marian used to run to the school to pick up Stephen, but after the little sister started kindergarten, the eldest of the family protested. "I'm a big boy," he told his mother. "I can walk to school on my own." "You're only 9?" Marian objected. Stephen only furrowed his eyebrows stubbornly. "The school's near the house. You've got 2 kids to drag from kindergarten, and then you have to follow me. And I'm ashamed to walk with my mom, like a little kid, honestly." His mom sighed and agreed. Once Stephen had made up his mind about something, there was no changing his mind. In time, Marian fell into this cycle of home life and didn't even realize she'd ever worked. Matthew's money was enough for them. And her husband was satisfied with the fact that after work he had a clean house, a hot dinner, fed and washed children, and a wife who did not smell of chlorine and iodine. Only now Marian did not understand what she should do in this situation. She hasn't worked in 7 years. They live in a flat that still has a mortgage to pay for a few more years. The money they have now is only enough for a month at the most. If they cut back on all their expenses, 2 months. Of course, there was hope that Matthew would come to his senses and call. But her gut feeling told her that wasn't going to happen. And then what to do? Where do I get the money? Marian had no one to help her. She didn't know her father. Her mother never told her much about him. And her mom had died 5 years ago. "We've got to get a job," thought Marian. "Otherwise we'll soon be on the street." The woman who sat across from her took another look at her CV and sighed heavily. She lowered her heavy metal-rimmed glasses closer to the tip of her nose. It was getting towards evening, and the employment officer wanted to finish the day and go home as soon as possible. And here was this misunderstanding, a 35-year-old mother of 3 minor children who had last worked 7 years ago as a nurse in a regular hospital. "I don't know what to offer you," she said. "I don't suppose you'd consider per diem or full-time work at all?" Marian sighed and waved her hands. The woman snorted unhappily. "Then I have nothing to offer you." "Nothing at all?" Marian clarified. "No." Noticing the disappointed look on Marian's face, the woman said, "I still have your phone number, and if anything comes up, I'll call you." "Thank you," Marian replied, smiled, and walked out, carefully closing the door behind her. Already outside, when she got into her old black Toyota, which she had bought before her marriage, Marian exhaled slowly and leaned back in the driver's seat. "It's okay," she said to herself. "We'll make it." She mentally counted the money she had left there should be enough for another month. She had already cut back on her own expenses, but she didn't want to save money on the children. Though if she couldn't find a job, she'd have to cut back on their clubs and activities. She could also sell some of her things, especially expensive clothes or shoes. Marian didn't have any, but it would be possible to take the jewelry, laptop, and maybe the TV from the bedroom to a pawn shop for appraisal. All the jewelry, TVs, laptop, and even Marian's new winter boots that Matthew had given her last New Year's Eve had already been sold. They were very nice, but uncomfortable, and she'd hardly ever worn them. Then she remembered and decided to check how much they were worth. Turned out to be a fortune. Marian dropped the price by a quarter, and within a couple of hours some happy woman took them. "I spent 6 months looking for them in all the shops," she told Marian. "Now all my girlfriends will be jealous of me." When she had gone, Marian breathed a sigh of relief. They could last another fortnight. What then? She had already cut every expense she could. There was nothing left to sell. Would she really have to settle for full-time work? What about the kids? Leave them alone from morning till night. Of course, Stephen's 14, Alex is 10, and Molly's 7. They're not toddlers. And the eldest has been telling his mother for a long time that he can handle the younger ones if she has to feed them, pick them up from school, make them do their homework. But does she have the right to put the responsibilities of adulthood on her boy's shoulders so early? The sound of the phone suddenly ringing almost made Marian jump. She wasn't expecting a call. And the number was unfamiliar. Normally she tried not to take such calls, but suddenly she thought that she was about to be told something good, because she was tired of bad news. "I'm listening," she said cautiously into the receiver, dreading the thought that she was about to be offered some kind of credit or told a story about a suspicious transaction on her card. But the pleasant female voice on the other end said something else. Marian? My name is Amanda. I got your number from the unemployment office. Are you still considering a job offer? Yes, Marian shouted hastily and then, ashamed of her impulsiveness, added more calmly, I'm still considering it. Good. Amanda seemed genuinely pleased. It says here that you've been a nurse for many years. You also have experience with critically ill patients. That's right, Marian replied. I would like to ask you if you would consider a job as a carer. Marian thought for a moment. She had never worked as a carer, but it was hardly more difficult than a nurse's job. If she'd ever handled an entire ward, she could certainly handle one seriously ill person. I can think about your offer, she said cautiously, but I'd have to know all the conditions. I'll be sure to tell you everything Amanda promised. Would it be convenient for you to come to my office at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning? Yes, of course. Great. Then I'll text you the address. I'll see you tomorrow. Goodbye, Marian replied and pressed the end button. Her heart was pounding frantically for some reason. No, of course it was too early to rejoice, but at least one sentence had come to life again, and hope had been rekindled in her. After taking the children to school, Marian drove to her appointment. On the way, she once again ran through her mind the answers to all the questions she thought she might be asked. She also wrote out in notes on her phone what she wanted to find out for herself. Amanda's office was located right in the center of the city. A huge, modern business center. When Marian stepped into the new, shiny, almost silent lift, she thought that Amanda must be working for some very wealthy people. Good afternoon, she was greeted in the reception area by a pretty young girl. Amanda's secretary, I think. My name is Vivienne. I have an interview here at 10 o'clock, Marian informed her. For the position of a carer, she said sympathetically or surprisingly, but she pulled herself together and smiled politely. Please have a seat. I will clarify everything now. Marian sat down, and the secretary rang the telephone and asked something quietly and quickly into the receiver. The answer was apparently in the affirmative. Then Vivian stood up, smiled once more at Marian and said, Amanda is expecting you. Come in. Marian was escorted to the door like royalty. For a second she was even frightened. A place like this wouldn't treat a mere nurse like that. Maybe she was confused. Hello, Marian said timidly as she entered the office. Amanda appeared to be a pretty woman about her age. Black hair, gathered in a neat low ponytail, business suit, expensive glasses. Good afternoon, Marian, she said. Please have a seat. She pointed with her hand to a cushioned armchair directly across from her. Marian sat down. Amanda smiled and clicked on the clipboard lying on the desk in front of her. According to our information, you have extensive experience as a nurse, including you indicated that you've cared for critically ill patients? Marian nodded. And you are also considering a position as a carer. Is that correct? That's correct, Marian confirmed. Good. I'm representing a client who needs a carer. Mr. Jacob has been paralyzed from the waist down for a number of years, and he has several other cardiovascular, respiratory, and digestive problems. Marian nodded again, showing she was listening intently. From a physical point of view, your job would not be considered hard, Amanda continued. The whole house is equipped for Mr. Jacob's needs. Motorized wheelchairs, lifts, handrails, and so on. There'll be no complicated medical procedures, either shots, pills, IVs, etc. Nothing a nurse couldn't master, I realized. Right, Marian said. Amanda paused, as if considering how best to present the next piece of information. Then she pressed her lip, as if she'd changed her mind about what she was going to say, and asked, I believe you have children? Yes, Marian nodded. 3. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. They're all in school, aren't they? Yes. So they'll be on holiday soon? Yes, in a couple of weeks. Are you considering accommodation? Amanda asked. Our client's house is out of town, and it would be inconvenient for you to go there every day. Marian shook her head. I don't have anyone to leave my children with, she said, frustrated and thinking she was going to be told goodbye. But suddenly Amanda spoke up. You don't have to leave them. You will live with them together in the grounds of the manor in the annex. To be exact, it's a detached building, very spacious, very cozy. I assure you, you'll like it." Marian looked at her incredulously. "Are you saying that the four of us will just be allowed to live in a tenant's house?" Amanda nodded and smiled happily. "What's more, you won't even have to cook. The meals are free, as is the accommodation. You will be fed with the rest of the staff of the manor." "Sounds tempting," Marian said cautiously. "I'm beginning to suspect there's a catch." "Exactly," Amanda confirmed cheerfully. "I suppose you'd like to know the hours and wages?" "I would," said Marian cautiously. Amanda nodded. Her neatly manicured fingers ran across the screen of the tablet. She turned it toward Marian. Marian's eyes widened. "This is for the week," Amanda explained. "A week?" Marian was even more surprised. "That much money?" Amanda sighed a little too humanly, which was very unlike her image of an impeccable business assistant. "I realize you're expecting a catch." "And there is," she said. Marian pressed her lips together, nodded slowly, and looked questioningly at Amanda. She rubbed the bridge of her nose tiredly. "The thing is, Mr. Jacob is a very particular man, and he has a difficult temper. Not everyone can get along with him." Marian breathed out a sigh of relief. "That's it? I've seen all sorts of people in my years at the hospital, and we've never been paid so much for being unhealthy." "That's not quite all," Amanda shook her head. "I can't promise you'll have a steady schedule. Roughly speaking, if Mr. Jacob thought of calling you in at 2 a.m., that would mean you'd have to get up and show up." "But everything you've said so far is true, isn't it?" Marian asked. "Yes, the salary that I wrote you is paid once a week, because the staff doesn't usually stay there for a long time," Amanda answered. "You and the children will live in a separate building and eat at the employer's expense. If you or the children need to go into town, we will provide you with a car and driver. And in return, I have to look after an elderly, capricious millionaire and be ready to appear at his beck and call at any moment." You could say that Amanda nodded. "I am ready," said Marian. "When can we start?" It took them a while to complete the paperwork. Then Marian waited until the children were on holiday. Finally, they packed all the necessary things and drove to the manor to the mysterious Jacob. "Are you sure he's not some kind of freak?" Alex asked her. "We're all going to his place. We don't know where to go." Marian blushed. They were traveling in a car with a driver sent directly by her employer. She looked in the mirror and saw that the driver, who introduced himself as Marcus, was smiling. "Alex, we're not going somewhere. We're going to an upmarket village," Marian said indignantly. "Jacob is normal, please, nothing extra. If you have to meet Jacob, you realize how important this job is to me." "Jacob will probably only get to know you," Marcus said. "He doesn't like new people very much, and he wanted me to bring you straight to the outhouse." "I see," replied Marian. A short time later, they entered the village. "Wow," Alex commented. "If there are crazy people living here, they are very rich." Stephen laughed, and Molly nearly broke the glass she had pressed her forehead against to get a good look. "Yes," thought Marian, "there are some very rich people living here." They drove past huge mansions surrounded by large fences. "That's nothing," Marcus said cheerfully. "You haven't seen Jacob's main house yet." "The next one will be more interesting," Marcus said. After they had driven through the village, there was a large area surrounded by a beautiful, elegant, but very high fence. The driver pressed some button on a small black remote control that appeared in his hand, and the gate opened. "We are now entering the grounds of the manor," Marcus commented. They drove for a long time along the road, which was surrounded on both sides by rows of neatly trimmed trees. Then a huge modern house, made of glass and metal, appeared in front of them. But the car did not go towards the mansion, but turned left. A few minutes later, they stopped in front of a small, neat wooden house. Marian and the children got out of the car. "It's beautiful," said Marian. "This outhouse must be very old." Marcus, who had also got out of the car, and was already taking their suitcases out of the boot, replied. Yes, it was built more than half a century ago. But don't worry. The outbuilding was restored only recently, about 2 years ago. There's water, electricity, everything. It looks like something out of a 19th century novel, said Stephen. That's right, the driver replied, coming up to the porch with his suitcases in his hands. I don't know exactly, but I think that was the idea. When they went inside, Marian noticed that, despite the seeming compactness of the outbuilding, it was very spacious inside. There was a small entrance hall, which almost immediately led into a living room, apparently connected to the kitchen dining room. A spacious en-suite bathroom, and, most importantly, 4 bedrooms. Wow, Alex shrieked. Am I going to have a separate bedroom? Marian smiled. Apparently, yes. In the old flat, the brothers had shared a room, and only Molly had her own bedroom. Stephen looked at his mother and smiled. He's all grown up now, isn't he? Suddenly, Marian thought that he needed his own room for a long time. Meanwhile, Marcus had already brought in all their things and said, "Make yourselves comfortable, have a rest. I think in about an hour they'll be here to take you to lunch. You'll get to know everyone there." "Thank you, Marcus," Marian said sincerely. He smiled. "It was nice to meet you all. I hope you enjoy your time here and stick around." In the hour they had, everyone had time to put their things away and settle into their new place of residence a little. Alex and Molly even ran around the outhouse. There they found a gazebo, a swing, and some well-tended flower beds. "Mummy, I love it here," Molly exclaimed, running up to Marian and hugging her legs. Marian smiled and stroked her daughter's hair. "I'm very glad," she said. "I hope you won't be bored here." "Not while you're working," the younger one said confidently. At that moment, there was a knock at the door. "Yes, come in," Marian answered. A tall, blonde-haired man with brown eyes walked into the cabin. He was dressed simply in a white t-shirt and black jeans, but he held himself so freely and confidently that Marian immediately realized that this man plays not the least role here. "Good afternoon, everyone." The first thing the stranger said was, "Hello. My name is Robert. I'm Jacob's assistant and the manager of this house." "Nice to meet you," she said. "My name is Marian, and these are my children, Stephen, Alex, and Molly." "Hello," they said in unison. Robert smiled. "It's a pleasure. I'm sure you will revitalize our sleepy kingdom. Now I invite you all to lunch." He led them down an inconspicuous path that led to the side entrance of the mansion. Through this door, they passed into a large and cozy kitchen. "Here are our newcomers." A woman's voice greeted them cheerfully. Marian saw a short, slightly overweight woman in her 50s. "I'm Camila," she said. "I am in charge of the food in this house. Come to the table." Marian introduced herself and the children, and they were seated at the table. There were about 10 other people besides them. They were all employees of the manor. They introduced themselves to Marian, but she was so nervous that she couldn't really remember anyone, just smiled and nodded. At Marian's right hand sat Robert. "Don't worry," he whispered in her ear. "You'll remember everyone in a couple of days." "How do you know what I was thinking?" Marian asked. "It's not difficult," replied Robert. "When I came to work here and everyone was introduced to me, I thought the same thing." Marian grinned. Her first fear had receded. Everyone seemed to be very nice and friendly here. Also, the kids were very well behaved after they ate lunch. Robert took Marian to meet the supervisor, and Marcus volunteered to give the children a tour of the estate. When Robert and Marian stopped in front of the office door, her employer's assistant began to speak softly, looked her in the eye, and said, "Marian, remember the most important thing: any comments Jacob will let slip about you have nothing to do with you personally. He is just an old, sick man with a hard fate and a very bad temper. In fact, that's why we're willing to give you such a great salary and facilities." "Thank you for telling me, Robert. But don't worry, I'm tougher than I look." "I'm sure you are." Then he knocked and opened the door. At last came a creaky, aged voice. "I thought I was going to die in here before any of you bothered to come in. I wonder why I pay you, all you bums, so much money." In a chair by the window sat an old, hunched old man. Marian thought that this was the kind of man they drew in books when they described an orphan protagonist who lived with an evil old relative. It was obvious that Jacob used to be a tall, sturdy man. Though the years had dried him up and pulled his head to the ground, his shoulders were still broad and even a little proud. Short gray hair, wrinkled neck, stubble, long straight nose, tightly closed lips, and angry, prickly eyes. They must once have been blue or green, but now they had faded so much that it was impossible to tell, and with those eyes he studied Marian coldly. It was as if Marian was being scanned, checking what was inside her. "Is it this one?" Jacob asked Robert, ignoring her completely, as if Marian herself were incapable of answering him. "That's Marian," the assistant answered. "She will be your new nurse." "Hello," said Marian, deciding that she would not stand here waiting to be addressed. Jacob frowned as if he'd eaten something sour. "Yes," he said, "it gets worse every time. Come on, Robert, let's go see what we can do with her." The assistant smiled encouragingly at Marian and went out. Without Robert, Marian immediately felt somehow defenseless, but she was determined that she would not let her charge spoil her mood. She needed this job. She liked the bright, spacious outhouse they were put in. She liked being able to spend quality time with the children. She liked the fact that she didn't have to go anywhere, and she certainly wasn't going to be leaving here in a week. So Marian pulled herself together, smiled, and said, "Well, where do we start? How about a shave for starters? Otherwise you look very overgrown, not like a millionaire, but like a homeless man." Oh, why did I say that she immediately thought in horror? I wanted to say something else about my skills, about what a highly skilled nurse I am. Now he's going to fire me for sure. Jacob raised his bushy gray eyebrows in surprise and suddenly laughed like a madman. "Like a homeless man, you say?" he said, when he could laugh. "Well, take me to the bathroom, if that's the case." "Where's your bathroom?" she asked. The old man rolled his eyes. "Yeah, that's professionalism in all its glory," he grumbled. Then he pressed a button on the arm of the chair, and it went somewhere along the line. All she had to do was follow him. Jacob led her into a large, airy room. It took Marian a few seconds to explore the place and marveled at how conveniently everything was arranged. She found a cape, shaving foam, and a clipper. "Do you even know how to do that?" Jacob asked her doubtfully. "I do," Marian said calmly. The last time she had used a clipper had been a long time ago, when she was still working at the hospital. One of her patients had asked her to shave his neck before an operation. He couldn't do it himself, his hands were too shaky. "That's all right," thought Marian, "I can do it now." When she had finished, she looked with satisfaction at the result of her work. "There," she said, turning her ward to the mirror. A different look. Jacob saw himself and gasped. "What have you done, you fool?" he shouted. "Couldn't you at least leave a few millimeters? Why cut everything to 0? You can see all my wrinkles and folds. I look like I'm about to die." Marian looked in the mirror, but decided not to show fear. "It's hygienic," she said sternly. "And it suits you better, believe me, as a woman." The old man chuckled. "Any man has ever been a woman." Marian's face seemed to flush. Yes, she had come here in a simple dress, with her hair unsightly in a ponytail, but to take her for an old maid was too much. "Don't worry," she said dryly. "I have 3 children." Jacob whistled. "And from different men, too." One, Marian said wryly. "But he's an interesting guy, having 3 kids and a woman to work with." Marian pressed her lips together. "We broke up." "Why are you panting like that? Did you run away?" "That's none of your business," she said more sharply than she intended. "What's next on the plan?" "Snake, get the clipboard from the table," the old man grumbled. Marian should have left a detailed schedule there. The tablet was found in the indicated place. Marian ran her eyes over it. Yes, there's a lot to do. It seems that Jacob is indeed seriously ill. at least judging by the number of pills and shots he gets every day. "Have you had lunch yet?" she clarified. "No, I was waiting for you." "Of course I've had lunch, I see." Marian decided not to react to the abruptness. "Then you have rest and IVs now," she said. "You're a genius." Jacob pulled the tablet down so his fingers shared the screen but said nothing. "Are we going to drip lying down or standing up?" How many more stupid questions are there going to be today, Marian thought. Marian, hardly gritting her teeth, answered, "There will be questions until I fully understand your regimen and appointments. For your information, some patients prefer to sit during the procedure. I'm thrilled for them. We're laying on you," she continued, ignoring the sarcastic tone, "which means there should be a couch." Marian began to look round. The old man sighed and nodded his head. "There's a door over there that leads to the treatment room." The IV went relatively quietly, too. Marian was afraid she wouldn't get into a vein the first time after all. It had been years since she'd injected. But today she was lucky. Jacob even closed his eyes and dozed off. He woke up when she was pulling the needle out of his vein. "We're going for a walk now," Marian said. "Really?" said the old man. "I thought it was a tambourine dance." Marian wondered how she had so much patience. She was used to strangers being so rude and disrespectful to her, for just doing her job. Jacob hired her for this job, if you think about it. It's understandable that she wouldn't know anything on the first day. Can't she have a little self-restraint? Marian thought as she walked through the garden beside his chair. Why should he? He's a millionaire. He's not used to restraining himself. He must have had more than one carer before her. And if she fails or decides to leave, his team will find another one the same day. In the meantime, he can just take his anger out on people like they're his punching bags. During the walk, however, Jacob was a little quieter. It was as if he was immersed in his own memories, not paying attention to Marian, who was walking beside him. He just rolled along the paths, automatically switching buttons to turn in the right direction. He doesn't really need me right now, Marian thought. He can ride on his own. The paths are perfect everywhere. But according to the terms of the contract, I must accompany him at all times and never leave him alone. "I wonder if you like that kind of work, Merlin?" Jacob asked suddenly. "I'm Marian," she corrected. "I don't care. It's just a job, a normal job." He chuckled. "You don't say. I have a lot of my own companies, employing thousands of people. If I wanted to, I could buy up all the houses in this village. That's a proper job." "You can leave me at the barb," the old man continued through gritted teeth. "If you stay, you'll do a lot of other, less pleasant things. Isn't that what you dreamed of at school?" Marian felt herself getting really angry. "I don't know why you started this conversation," she said honestly. Jacob grinned. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself in front of the kids? You're a grown woman working as a nurse. You don't even have to be smart about it. Just do as you're told. A monkey could do it. Or is that all you're not clever enough to do?" "If the monkey could do it, why do you change carers so often?" Marian asked. "Maybe it's because you don't treat them like people, but like animals. I think I'd agree that chimpanzees or gorillas would be a better fit. At least they wouldn't understand how you treat them." The old man laughed. "I'm a millionaire. Manners don't suit you, princess. You can leave even today. I'll even ask Robert to pay you a week's salary in advance." For a second, Marian wanted to take the money, grab the children, leave and never see this arrogant, nasty old man who treats her like some baron with servants. "No," she said to herself, "that's what he wants, and I'll never get another job like that." Marian remembered how many CVS she'd sent, how many times she'd been rejected, how many evenings she'd sat thinking about what else she could sell to pay the mortgage and food. "I'm fine with it," she said cheerfully to Jacob, and even found the strength to smile. "We've got dinner and evening treatments coming up, so I think you should turn your vehicle in the opposite direction." Marian had been working for Jacob for a fortnight now, and every day she felt like she couldn't hate the man more. And every new day he proved her otherwise. The old man always found something to pick on about Marian: her appearance, her voice, her gait, words spoken with the wrong accent. Once she got overexcited and didn't get into his vein the first time. He remembered it for 3 days. Marian was shaking with unfair resentment, anger, and most of all, powerlessness. She realized that Jacob was aware of her predicament and was taking advantage of it. He was used to power, used to being first in everything, to being obeyed, to being feared. And now he is just a pathetic, sick grandfather who is left all alone. Having plucked up courage, Marian once asked Robert if their boss had a wife and children. "As far as I know," he replied, "no children, but he had 4 wives." 4? Marian gasped. "Yep, the first one he married when he was very young. I think she was from a rich family. Did he work for her father then, or did they have a business together?" "I don't know exactly. It was kind of a marriage of convenience. Jacob worked hard. His father-in-law noticed him and helped him start his own business. When the boss got big enough, he didn't need his wife, so he filed for divorce. Then there was some model about 10 or 15 years younger than him," Robert continued. "They lived with her for a while, 3 or 4 years. Then he caught her cheating on him and divorced her too. And the third, as far as I know, left him. She was also some young and beautiful girl who got bored with him." "Gee," sighed Marian. "And the fourth was already some old friend of his. They were the same age and had been friends for a long time. They'd married when they were both in their 50s. Both he and she had a few divorces under their belts. She was the one they seemed to have a good life with. But she died about 5 years ago of cancer." "Oh, that sounds sad," said Marian. "People who've been here longer than me say that's when he got the way he is now. He was supposedly quite tolerable before. No angel, of course, but he could live. Now he's getting worse every day." Marian sighed. "That's a very sad way of putting it. Doesn't he have any relatives?" Robert shrugged. "There seems to be a sister who has children and grandchildren of her own, but they live abroad and rarely come here." "He's a very lonely man," said Marian. "It's sad to be so ill, living alone in a huge house." "Aha," replied the steward. "So he takes out his poison on those around him." Every evening Marian looked forward to the end of the working day. Then she could finally live for herself, spend time with her children. They had settled in quite well, by the way. All the staff were very friendly to Stephen, Alex, and especially little Molly. Camila took care of them, feeding them goodies. Marcus, with Marian's permission, took the children for rides with him if he went somewhere not far away on the chief's errands. The boys had mastered the grounds of the manor with its huge garden and many beautiful quiet corners. The only thing they tried to do was to keep out of sight of the master of the house. It wasn't that hard, though. Jacob only went for walks when Marian was with him. It was usually in the morning, and only sometimes in the afternoon or late afternoon. A fortnight later, Marian was reminded for the first time that she had an irregular working day. She and the children had long since gone to bed when Marian's phone suddenly rang. Robert's number came up. "Yes, I'm listening," Marian mumbled sleepily. "Marian, get in the house right away. Jacob's having a seizure." Marian jumped up on the bed. She was wide awake. She had been warned that the ward could have such attacks. In such a case, Marian should immediately run into the house and administer first aid. She didn't even bother to get dressed, just threw on a dressing gown over her nightgown and rushed into the house. The lights were already on everywhere, and frightened night maids and guards were running around. Marian made her way to the bedroom without wasting time. Jacob was half lying on the bed, breathing so heavily that she could hear him whistling and wheezing from a distance. Beside him stood Robert, who had put the supervisor in, opened the windows, now pulling out anything Marian might need. She nodded gratefully to the manager and set to work. She put the oxygen mask on Jacob's blue face and started the oxygen supply. Then she quickly found the vials in the medicine cabinet, filled the syringes, and administered the injections. Fortunately, the attack was not severe, and the medicine began to take effect quickly. Marian watched carefully as the old man's pulse evened out, his breathing recovered, and his complexion returned to normal. "There," she said. "It's all right, Jacob." The old man nodded and gave a hoarse squeeze. "For someone who's just been hoofing it, that'll do." "You should have some hot tea with mint or linden now," Marian said. "I'll have them make it for you." "Yes," said the chief. And I have one more favor to ask of you. Will you do it? Marian nodded. Yes, of course. What is it? Next time move faster, or you'll be dead before you get there. Marian felt all her pity, which she had just felt, watching the old man suffering a seizure, as if blown away by the wind. I'll do my best, she replied discreetly. I'll go and tell him about the tea. A minute after Marian had asked for tea to be made, Robert came into the kitchen. How are you? He asked. All right. That's just the way he is. He'll play the villain to the last, even when he's dying. Marian asked. I think that's what he is. The steward sighed and ran his hand through his hair. You know, he said in a confidential tone, I sometimes think that the chief isn't really like that. It's just that at some point he's decided that this is the only way to communicate with the world, and he's afraid to act human. Marian shrugged her shoulders. A noble theory, Robert, but I'm sorry, I'm sure he's being sincere. Robert smiled. How about some coffee? He suggested. No, I'd rather go to bed. Good night. Good night, Marian. The next day, when Marian and the children came for breakfast, Robert made an unexpected announcement. Marian, you have the day off today. Why is that? She wondered. The manager shrugged his shoulders. The chief said so. His sister and her children are visiting him. Apparently they'll look after him. Marian frowned. And the injections? IVs? Robert waved his hand. Don't worry, we call a nurse from the private clinic for such cases. Why doesn't she come every day? Why should I? Marian didn't understand. The boss doesn't like new people. Camila suddenly intervened in their conversation with a smile. He was just putting the children on the second portion of pancakes, so he demands that there should be one constant. Someone who knows all his habits. I see, Marian replied. That's why he drives people crazy and makes them quit, she added mentally. And it's more pleasant to abuse a permanent slave than nurses from a private clinic who will be different every time. But she didn't want to say it out loud in front of the kids. Let them think she had a good job. We've almost all got the day off, Marcus added. If you don't mind, Marian, and you guys too. I can take the kids to the zoo and then we can go out for lunch on the way, Marcus said. Yes, Uncle Marcus, Molly shouted happily. Of the three, she was most attached to the young, cheerful driver, who always paid attention to the children. No, my good ones, Robert said firmly. Marcus has the day off and I can't force you on him. The driver waved his hand. Don't worry, Robert, he said. I'm going there with my nephew anyway. He's 10, and I'll take yours with me. 2, it won't be a problem. Marian looked at the children doubtfully. We'll behave, Alex said, looking at his mother pleadingly. The eldest shrugged his shoulders, saying that if necessary he would go. Marian never worried about his behavior. All right, she sighed. Then I'll go get the money. No need, Marcus replied. The chief always leaves money for such small expenses. The others present nodded. Don't even worry about it, Camila assured her. After breakfast, Marcus and the children went to the garage to start the car and drive to the zoo. Robert and Marian were the only ones left. Do you have plans for the day off? The assistant asked Marian. I don't know. I should probably go into town, see how the flat is. Robert perked up. Do you want to go for a ride together? I've got a couple of chief cases to take care of. It won't take long, and then we can see your flat. And we can have lunch on the way back if you don't mind. Yes, that's all right, said Marian. Robert was easy and comfortable with her. He could keep up a conversation without being intrusive. He talked interestingly about the things he was doing now, but did not spill too much. Marian suddenly realized how little she had ever had such simple human companionship in her life. After she quit her job, all she had left in her life was her husband and children. Sure, there were her friends from college and work, but they had their own lives, husbands, kids, jobs. And they didn't get to see each other very often. and after Matthew left, she'd lost herself. Constant thoughts of how to find a job, how to pay the rent, worrying about how her children would feel about their father leaving. There was no time for herself. "How long have you been working for Jacob?" she asked Robert. He thought for a few seconds. 5 years. That's a long time. "Well, if you don't count me, I'm hardly the newest guy in the house." "Wow, how you're all holding up. Is there a secret, or was the manager not like this before?" The manager laughed. "When I came, he was perhaps a little gentler, but he wasn't particularly kind. I won't hide it. He's not easy for me either." "I can imagine," said Marian, sighing. Robert smiled. "For the first 6 months I wanted to quit, probably 7 times a day, then a little less often. Now I don't think about it at all." "Why not?" Marian frowned. "Salary, of course, it plays its part too. Not the last, but not the first." "What else?" Marian wondered. "Robert is so clever, so confident. He must be a good professional and, unlike her, could find many more excellent jobs." "Experience," Robert said. "I not only run the house, but I help Jacob run his business remotely. Don't look so weak and decrepit. He's got a pretty good head." Marian wasn't sure, but she decided not to argue. "And now I'm unlikely to find another job where I can watch how to manage such a huge amount of money," the assistant continued. "Understand?" "I do," said Marian. "Except that your life keeps revolving around Jacob. Don't you feel sorry for yourself? Your wife and children hardly ever see you at home." Robert laughed. "I guess I don't look very young," he replied. "But I'm only 33. Marian was confused. "I don't know what you mean," she admitted. "And you look wonderful." "Thank you." "May." "I'm flattered. It's not every day I get compliments from such beautiful young women," Robert said. "I mean, I don't have a wife or children yet." "A fiancé?" Marian asked. "No, no girlfriend." "I see that looks suspicious," laughed Marian. "A little," Robert admitted. "I'm just a workaholic. I want to start a family when I'm sure I can provide for them. By the way, we're here. It'll be 15 minutes in the rain. Then we'll see your flat." "Of course," Marian replied. Robert took some folder with documents and went out. Marian was left alone in the car. She suddenly thought that perhaps, like Robert, she would be tied to this house and the mean old man for years to come. "Okay, it's summer now. What about in the autumn when the kids go to school?" she pondered. Marian suddenly realized that Amanda, who had hired her, hadn't talked to her about the matter, most likely because she hadn't counted on Marian holding out this long. And Marian has, and she's not going to quit. "No, Jacob can't wait," she thought, biting her lip painfully, remembering last night. She'd been truly afraid for him then, and for the first time since then, sorry. As soon as he could breathe, he'd snapped at her. Robert came back and interrupted her sad thoughts. He looked pleased. "What? Let's go to your place?" he asked. "Let's go," Marian replied. Everything was fine in her flat, too. It was as unlikely as anything could happen, but Marian was still more used to being in control. "Lunch now," Robert said cheerfully. "I'll show you a lovely place. But I don't think they cook as well as our Camila does." "Oh yes," sighed Marian. "Nothing can compare to her food. But I'll try to surprise you." Robert took her to a large Georgian restaurant on the top floor of a large shopping center. There was pleasant national music playing. The air conditioners were running at full blast, which was especially nice after a hot summer day. They were escorted to a table with 2 soft sofas right by the window. From there they had a view of the river and the new high bridge. "Would you mind if I chose for you?" Robert asked. "Go ahead," Marian replied cheerfully. "I don't know anything here anyway." "Fine," Robert replied. When the waiter came, Robert pointed his finger at several items on the menu without showing Marian. So she didn't know what to expect. She was surprised when the first thing she got was a glass of red wine. "It's only lunchtime," she reminded her companion. "So, Robert asked. Marian sighed because she couldn't find any other arguments. Aren't you going to have any? She inquired. I'm driving. Definitely not, Robert replied. The wine was both moderately sweet and tart. Marian savored the taste and suddenly thought she couldn't remember the last time she had sat like this and spent time quietly with a glass of wine. Thank you, she said. This is the most wonderful weekend I've ever had. Robert smiled. Wait to thank you, he said. The food hasn't arrived yet. Marian liked the food very much. The soft, hot dough of the khachapuri with the slightly difficult-to-stretch cheese, the salad with crisp mini aubergines and lots of greens, the flavorful meat, and the juicy sauces. Oh, she said, leaning back on the soft back of the couch. That was wonderful. I'm very glad, Robert replied. He was leaning back and apparently unable to move either. It seems that it will take us some time to recover, Robert remarked. Marian nodded lazily and took a sip of wine. I fully support it, she said. In the meantime, we can talk. Robert raised his eyebrows in surprise. That sounds scary, he said. Marian laughed. I'm not your wife to make it sound scary. Not yet. Anyway, I'm listening. Marian laughed. For some reason, she felt very light and good. Tell me about yourself, she asked, and then confessed, You're a mystery to me. That's quite a confession, Robert grinned. Why is that? I wondered. I just don't know anything about you, said Marian. Neither do you about me, Robert remarked. Fair enough. But let's start with you, Marian suggested. Robert chuckled. Well, let's. I'm not from around here, he began. I was born in a small town far, far away from here. Yes, I went to an ordinary village school. Lived in an ordinary family, but always had great ambition. Marian smiled. So Robert continued. I decided to come here. It wasn't easy, but I managed. The student years were fun. Then I got a job second, third, fourth. Then I got to Jacob. Do you know the rest of it? I have a feeling you've left a lot out of your story, Marian said thoughtfully. Who knows, maybe I'll tell you about it later, Robert said. Now we need to talk about you. Good. But I haven't got anything interesting either, admitted Marian. I'm a local, but only my mum raised me. I never met my father, and my mum never told me much about him. She was a music teacher. So, as you know, we didn't live very well. Did you go to music school? Robert asked. Marian sighed. It was a terrible 7 years of my life, she said. I can only remember one tune now. Mum made me play it most often. Everything else has faded from my memory. I've played this one so many times that if you woke me up at 2 a.m., I could play it with my eyes closed. What's the tune? Bach, Chopin, Tchaikovsky? Robert asked. No, it's not classical for sure, replied Marian. Honestly, I don't even know. Mum never told me who the author was. We certainly didn't study it at school. I have a theory that she composed it herself, but I can't say it's true. Well, go on, said Robert, and then he interrupted himself. Do any of your children go to music school? No one, Marian cut him off. Robert laughed. Shall I order you some more wine? She shrugged, and Robert asked for another glass. Unlike you, I didn't do very well at school, she continued. The only thing I could count on after high school was college. And for some reason, I suddenly decided I wanted to be a nurse. I thought it was a very beautiful, noble, and romantic profession, said Marian. It is, Robert agreed. Not a bit of it. Marian sighed. No, I don't regret it. Studying was interesting, and so was working. It was at work that I met Matthew, my husband. He was a patient of yours. Yeah, I'd just started working. I didn't really know how to do anything on my own. I remember my hands shaking when I was giving injections or dressings. I thought I could see it from a mile away. But Matthew didn't notice. Robert smiled. I'm sure he fell in love with you at first sight. He said he did. Marian nodded. In fact, I liked him too. Soon we started seeing each other, and 6 months later we were married. And then I found out I was pregnant. You've become a very young mum, Robert smiled. Yes, of course it was difficult at first. But then Mum was still alive and she helped me a lot, said Marian and sighed. Then Stephen grew up and went to kindergarten. I went to work, but not for long. When he turned 4, I got pregnant with Alex. And 3 years later, Molly was born. Wow. After Molly was born, we decided I was going to stay at home. That's why I didn't work for 7 years. Wow, Robert said. I must say you're doing a wonderful job, especially after such a break. Marian smiled. Thank you. That's nice to hear. Can I ask you a personal question? Ask away, she nodded to Robert. Marian took another sip of wine. Why did you separate from your husband? Robert asked. Why did I leave my husband? She asked him again. Yes, he left me. Maybe the wine played a part. Maybe it's been a while, but it's the first time I've ever made that confession so easily. He just left a note saying he was in love with another woman, she explained. He didn't even talk to you, Robert wondered. Marian shook her head. What about the children? He didn't even say goodbye to them either? How awful, Robert exclaimed. Marian smiled. I don't know what you mean. What horror. It's all right, she said. I'm fine now. Is that why you're holding on to this job? Robert guessed. Exactly, Marian nodded. They were silent for a few minutes. Each was digesting everything that had been said in the dialogue. Then Marian asked, What about your personal life? You're only 2 years younger than me. I can't believe you haven't had a serious relationship. Robert smiled kind of sadly. I have, and for quite a long time. I started dating an ambitious girl when I was still in college. I had that quality too. Only our goals were different. My ambitions were career-related, and hers were to find a successful man. Aren't you a successful man? Marian asked in surprise. Thank you for saying that. It's hard for me to judge that myself. Then I tell you that you are a successful man, interrupted Marian. Much obliged, Robert replied. Well, anyway, my beloved did not consider me a successful man, and she broke up with me because she said she was worthy of more. A very stupid woman, commented Marian. After that statement, I'm obliged to pour you more wine, Robert said, indicating to the waiter to repeat himself. Oh, sighed Marian, I haven't drunk so much in a long time. So Robert continued. She left me, and I decided that I would become the successful one, and she would come back to me. And how did it go? Marian asked. Great. In the process, I realized that I don't want to be with a woman for whom I'm not good enough, for whom I'm important not as a person but as a social status. Marian nodded. And I don't want to be with a man who gave birth to 3 children. And then he left, leaving only a note on the table, she confessed. Robert smiled sadly. I fully support such a wise decision. In the morning, Marian woke up with difficulty. Her head ached and her mouth was dry. The light of the sun shining through the curtains seemed unbearably bright. I overslept, she thought with horror. And I probably didn't even set my alarm clock last night. The clock, however, showed it was still early. Marian showered, brushed her teeth. After making sure the children were still asleep, she slipped quietly out of the outhouse and into the house. Camila was already bustling about in the kitchen. Oh, Marian. The woman greeted her cheerfully. Good morning. How are you up early this morning? Yes, said Marian hoarsely. It seems I had a very stormy day off yesterday. Camila smiled understandingly. Now everything will be. In an hour you will be awake and cheerful, like a 15-year-old schoolgirl. A minute later she put a huge cup of fragrant tea in front of Marian, smelling of berries and herbs. The best cure for a hangover, said Camila confidently. And eat this too. She set down a plate with a large sandwich with meat, lettuce, tomato and egg. "This is the most delicious thing I've ever eaten in my life," Marian said blissfully as she ate her breakfast. "You're magic." "Thank you," Camila replied, embarrassed. By the beginning of the working day, Marian had recovered enough. Jacob had been unusually friendly today. Perhaps it was the meeting with his relatives, but he hardly commented on Marian's actions and did not make any derogatory comments. "You're remarkably quiet today," said Marian, as they went out for their traditional afternoon walk after lunch. "Don't let it get to you while it's quiet," Jacob said, but not in a mean-spirited way. "All right, I won't," Marian said. "Those are your children, aren't they?" He pointed to Alex and Molly, who were chasing each other around the fountain. Stephen was sitting on a bench, reading a book with one eye and watching the younger ones with the other. "Mine," replied Marian, horrified at the thought that she was about to be reprimanded, but her ward only nodded. "They're good, and they seem to be friendly." "Thank you," Marian replied cautiously. "Are you raising them alone?" Continued to show unexpected interest Chief. "I am now." "That's why you put up with me," Jacob said, realizing it was a statement, not a question. "I wanted to have many children when I was young, too," Jacob said suddenly. "It didn't work out." "You've been married 4 times, haven't you?" Marian asked in surprise, and then a twinge. It was hardly appropriate to know such information. But strangely enough, the chief did not comment on it. "Yes, he replied. Jacob stared ahead, as if he were mentally reviewing his whole life. "Didn't your first wife want children?" Marian asked. "Yes, I didn't at the time, either," Jacob answered. "She and I were young and spoiled. Both of us from rich families wanted to have fun and enjoy life. Or rather, my wife did. I was interested in building a business at the time." "So why did you get married?" "My parents insisted. It was good for the business. Actually, I didn't mind. She was a pretty girl. I thought I'd get used to her. Well, after a few years, it became clear that we were completely different people. I got divorced and went to work." He stopped talking. "Can I have some water, please?" Jacob asked suddenly. Marian hurriedly held out the bottle. "Please," she thought, wondering for the first time in weeks what was happening to him. Jacob sipped and continued. "I don't have much to say about my second, third wives. I married them, I don't know, just for status. Young, beautiful. I thought it would be great, but every time I realized quickly that it wasn't what I wanted. And all they wanted from me was money." He fell silent again. Marian held out the water, but the old man shook his head negatively. Then there was another situation. This is what could have been true love. "Your fourth wife?" Marian asked. "No, that was before her. I didn't marry that girl. It was a waste, as I thought many times afterwards, but I don't want to talk about it. It's too personal." "And what he's telling me now isn't too personal," thought Marian, but yet for some reason he chose to share it with her. "The fourth wife became more of a friend to me," Jacob said. "I already knew about her diagnosis when I proposed marriage." "Diagnosis?" Marian asked. "Yes, Samantha had cancer. In fact, she and I had known each other for years, too. Our parents had been friends since childhood. Over the years, we'd kept in touch from time to time, and then suddenly we met and talked and decided that we could spend a few years together." "Were you with her all the way to the end?" Marian asked. The man nodded. "She was a wonderful woman and a true friend. After she died, I didn't need anyone else," Jacob said. "I sympathize with you," she said sincerely. It was as if Jacob woke up. "You and I have been talking," he said. "Come on, let's go home. It's time for my evening pills." After this strange conversation, Marian felt sorry for her ward again. It couldn't be said that their communication improved much after that. Jacob could still speak harshly to her, but now she somehow took it easier. Summer was coming to an end, and Marian wondered what to do when the children went to school. "How do you like it here?" she asked them one day. "I like it very much, ahead of the rest of them," Molly replied. "Aunt Amanda cooks good food. Uncle Marcus takes us everywhere. There's a big garden, so we can play all day long. You have to go back to school soon, she reminded her daughter, who wrinkled her nose funny. I don't want to go to school, she said. Marian sighed and looked at her middle son. I like it here too, Alex said. But about school, I understand that, he smiled at Marian. You have to go to it. Thank God I understand you. The answer is accepted, Marian said. She shifted her gaze to her eldest son. I think you and I need to talk, Stephen said. Come on, Marian agreed. They went out into the garden. Stephen sighed. Summer's coming to an end, he said. We all have to go to school soon. We have to think about what to do about accommodation. Marian smiled. You've got a good eye for detail, as always. The son nodded. Dad called me the other day, he admitted. Marian's eyes widened. When a few days ago? Why didn't he call me? Afraid, I guess. But the official story is that he's very busy. I see, sighed Marian. What did he want? As I understand it, he wants to meet you, maybe to discuss the divorce, or, on the contrary, wants to make up. Marian laughed. Reconcile? Well, maybe. Marian hesitated, but then decided to ask her son the question. Do you want that to happen? Stephen shook his head negatively. I don't mind the younger ones seeing him if they want to. I'll see him too if I have to, but the rest is up to you. He's your father, she said, but I don't think I love him anymore, and I can't forgive him for what he did. You don't have to forgive him. As for our school, maybe we should talk to Robert now. Will he think of something? I'll try. You're the smartest, she hugged her son. Everything will be fine, he said. Tell your father I'm ready to talk to him. Let him call. Don't be afraid. I'll tell him, Stephen promised. A few days later, after Marian and Jacob had finished their morning routine, Robert came in. Ready, Jacob? The assistant asked. Where can I go? The chief replied calmly. Let's go. Are you coming too? Robert turned the last word to Marian. She was surprised. She is, of course, replied the ward calmly. I have a lot of documents to sign and some personal meetings. You could be needed at any time to change nappies or wipe armpits. I have to have some dignity. What if I have an attack at night? I don't want to suffocate in front of my business partners. As they drove to the business center where Jacob was supposed to do business, the manager explained. We don't know exactly how long this will take. You can sit in the restaurant. It's in the same building on the top floor. Just tell him to put it on Jacob's tab. Okay, Marian replied. If you need anything, Robert will call, Jacob added. At the restaurant, Marian ordered tea and tiramisu. She suddenly thought it was a great opportunity to meet Matthew. He was kind of in town. Marian didn't get out here very often, and there were things she needed to discuss with her husband. She called her husband, and he was willing to come over. What a place you picked, he said as he sat down at the table. You look like you've lost a little weight. But you haven't changed, just like you've lost a little weight. You look amazing, he said. Thank you, said Marian. You too. He shrugged embarrassedly. I'm glad you called me. Marian sighed. We should have talked a long time ago, at least to decide when to file for divorce. Matthew frowned. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. It's great that we're on the same page here. He moved over and placed his hand gently on her arm. Maybe we're being hasty, he said. Maybe we shouldn't get divorced. Should I not believe my ears? Marian interrogated. It was you who left me, wasn't it? You left a note and left without even saying goodbye to the kids. Didn't pick up the phone, didn't return messages. Just disappeared from our lives as if we were nothing to you and you hadn't lived with me for 15 years. Just came round one evening for tea. Matthew froze in embarrassment. I'm sorry, he said. I don't know what was wrong with me then. It was just some kind of madness. I was out of my mind. Marian sighed and released her hand to rub the bridge of her nose. Was that it? She asked. I won't ask how and how much you cheated on me and why you decided to break up. I've known about it for a long time, but why couldn't you talk to me properly? Why did you abandon the children? My husband lowered his eyes. I know, he said. It must have been a midlife crisis or something. It's just that at some point everything started to go crazy. Work, life, 3 kids. You're always with the kids and I'm in the background. I'm sick of the whole thing. And your new love? Young, fun, carefree, childless? She asked. Sort of, he replied. I lost my head then. I was afraid to tell you, even more so for the kids. What changed? She asked. Her husband moved closer. I've realized in these months how much I've missed you and the children, he said. And I want things to go back to the way they were. Marian shook her head slowly. Nothing has changed, she said. We'll get back together. In a couple of weeks you'll go off with another girl. No, I won't do that, Matthew assured her. Marian sighed. Jaroslav, she said. I've had a lot of time to think about it, and I've realized that I can't forgive you. And my love for you has disappeared in that time too. I'm sorry, but I think we need to agree and decide when we go to file for divorce. Her husband's face suddenly changed. Marian suddenly saw clearly how his contrived tenderness and remorse came off. Then we must talk about the division of property, he said in a harsh tone. Marian was surprised at this abrupt change of subject. In fact, it amused her. Let's talk, she agreed. Your car goes to you. My flat goes to me and the kids. Matthew shook his head. No, let's sell it and split the money in half. Half. Marian smiled. I'm raising 3 kids on my own. Her husband was embarrassed, but he continued to stand his ground. I was paying her mortgage. And you didn't work? Sitting on my back? Yes, because I was taking care of the house and the 3 kids. And now I'm paying the mortgage. You left me out of the blue and didn't even help the kids. You can't imagine what I've been through these past few months. Well, then we'll get back together. The husband returned to the old topic, and we won't have to share the flat. Marian sighed. No, Matthew, I've already said everything. So you have her husband's voice suddenly lowered like a snake's hiss. And who will need you alone with 3 children? Do you think any man but me will look at you? You stupid pet chicken. All you know how to do is cook soup. Marian felt tears coming from her eyes. It hurt her to hear such words from the father of her children, from the man she had loved for so many years. Let's not play innocent, her husband continued. You yourself will come to me on your knees. She will not, said a familiar male voice behind her. She did not have time to see what happened next. Only Matthew suddenly flew across the restaurant and collapsed to the floor. Robert shook the hand that had just collided with her husband's jaw. That was harsh, but I guess it was understandable, Jacob commented. Marian looked up and saw the supervisor. He looked as pleased as a cat for some reason. And you're here? She asked in amazement. Everyone heard, he said rather dryly. Matthew rose slowly from the floor. He pressed his palm to his bloody lips. We'll talk to you again, he threw to Marian. Wow, Jacob said admiringly. I should get out of the office more often. This place is fun. Shall we go home? Robert asked Marian. We will, she answered quietly, wiping away her tears. She was sent to Camila's kitchen to drink tea and calm down. We have something to discuss with the boss, Robert said. You get some rest. I'll call you. But Marian had no appetite. She was replaying in her head what had happened in the restaurant. What's going to happen now? Will she be fired? Probably get fired. Jacob hardly needs a problem employee getting his assistant into fights in the middle of the business center. And what about the flat? Do we have to split it in half? Where will she and the kids live then? What if she has to find a new job, even if she doesn't get fired today? The school issue hasn't been canceled. With so many problems, Marian's head was spinning. "Marian, let's go," she raised her head. Robert's face didn't make it clear what judgment she had been given, so she stood up and obediently walked with him into the chief's office. "What a show you put on today," Marian Jacob said cheerfully. "I'm sorry," said Marian. "I didn't know that was going to happen." "Well, it was kind of funny," the chief said. "We have other things on the agenda." Marian squirmed. Now he was going to tell her everything. "Do you want to continue working here?" Jacob asked. "Are you firing me?" Marian asked. "Do you want to?" "No," she answered quickly. "Then I'm not." Good, he nodded. "Soon your children will have to go to school." "Yes," Marian confirmed cautiously. Jacob nodded. "We'll get them a car and a driver," Robert said, "to take them to school and bring them back." Marian opened her mouth. "But why?" she asked. "Because I don't want to look for a new employee," the chief replied calmly. "Thank you," Marian muttered. "And we also need to solve the housing issue," Robert added. "What about it?" she wondered. "Living in the outhouse in the winter is an option," Jacob said. "It's warm and everything, but it's not very comfortable to run out in the cold for breakfast. So let's look at your new rooms." "New rooms?" Marian shook her head incredulously. "There is an almost empty wing in the house," Robert explained. "That's where we intend to put you." They left the study and went in the direction of rooms where Marian had never been before. "What wing is this?" she asked curiously. Jacob sighed. "It's a part of my past," he said. "I wanted to forget it, not remember it. But now I realize it's time to let go of the past and look to the future." They went into the largest room. "This is the common room," said the chief. "From here there are 4 bedrooms. There's enough for you." Marian walked around in surprise, looking round the rooms. Each room looked like a separate work of art. Beautiful, tastefully chosen furniture, paintings on the walls, everything is thought out to the smallest detail. Except it looked like it hadn't been used in years. I wonder why, Marian thought. Suddenly she saw under the white cloth the outline of an object from her childhood. A grand piano. Marian exclaimed in amazement. "May I?" She turned to Jacob. He shrugged his shoulders. Marian carefully removed the white cloth that covered the instrument and ran her fingers over the keys. The instrument was a little distressed, but it was quite playable. Marian sat down. And she began to play the only tune she could remember, the one her mother had played, and many, many times since she was a little girl. The first few notes were difficult, but then her hands remembered it, and her fingers flew over the keys with ease. She sat with her back to Jacob and didn't see the change in the old man's face. First he stretched it out in astonishment. Then he turned his head, as if he wanted to make sure his hearing wasn't deceiving him. Then a tear rolled out of his right eye, then another from his left. Robert walked quietly over to the piano and stood facing Marian. He looked at her, and then suddenly he looked at the chief and couldn't hold back his astonished cry. "Jacob, what's the matter with you?" Marian immediately stopped, turned round in amazement. The old man was sobbing unashamedly and wiping his face with his shirt sleeve. "How do you know that tune?" he asked. "It was composed just for me." When Jacob was calmed down by the joint efforts of Marian and Robert, the chief asked for tea to be served to everyone. They returned to his office, and there the chief began his story. "When I met Vivian," he began, "I was still married to my third wife. She and I hardly ever saw each other even then. We only met to discuss how we were going to divide the property." He sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Anyway, I was getting really tired of it. Work, divorce. One day I just walked out of a business meeting, let the driver go, and just went to the park, sat on a bench, and realized how nice it was. Just sunshine, birds singing, trees turning green. And then I saw her, Vivian." Marian froze. Her heart was beating very fast. She couldn't believe what was happening. "So beautiful." "I've never seen such a beautiful woman," Jacob said dreamily. And then she looked at me and smiled. and I knew I was lost. Marian saw Robert looking at her and smiling. When he noticed her gaze, he seemed confused and started to look at his boss, who seemed to be oblivious to his surroundings. He was completely immersed in the memory of events that had taken place over 35 years ago. My feet led me to it, Jacob continued. And for the first time in my life, I was scared. I was so afraid she'd refuse to meet me. I'd been with a lot of women, but none of them had ever struck such awe in me. At first sight, to my delight, she said yes. He smiled blissfully. I've probably never been so happy. My wife and I were no longer living together. And so I brought Vivienne into this house and made this wing just for her. It's the sunniest side of the house. And the piano. She played for you? Yes, Marian interrupted him hoarsely. Vivienne taught music, and that tune you played she composed especially for me. Why did you break up? Marian asked. Another tear rolled down Jacob's face. A fool, because he said calmly. I wanted to marry Vivienne, and she refused me. Why? Marian asked. He sighed. Said we were from different worlds, that she didn't want to turn into just a rich businessman's wife and stay at home. That's how it is, muttered Marian. Yes, I persuaded her. I told her she could do whatever she wanted and be herself. She refused and ended our relationship first. Then why do you say it was your fault? Marian asked. Jacob sighed. Because I didn't insist. Because I gave in easily, because I didn't find out then that she was pregnant. Marian looked up at him. Jacob was looking straight at her. Yes, he said calmly. I'm sure you're my daughter. Marian stretched her legs blissfully and lifted her head, letting the sun shine on her face. She liked it here. The sea had always done her good, especially now that they got out there as a family every year. Mum, did you see it? Molly came running up to her. I swam the fastest. No, you didn't, shouted the middle son. It was obvious that he was tired and shutting down, but he was showing that he was inferior to his younger sister, who had been going swimming for 3 years and was performing well. He didn't mean to. I just gave in to you, Alex stated. Yeah, sure, the girl blurted out. She was already well aware of her own abilities and knew that her brother was swimming at full strength. Alex ran off resentfully towards the cabin. And you had to tease him, Marian gently reprimanded him. He wanted to compete. What am I supposed to do now? Go take a shower, we'll go to dinner soon. When her daughter ran away, she stretched, reluctantly got up from the sunbed and walked towards the cabin. She saw Stephen lying in the hammock, talking on the phone as usual. Talking to his girlfriend again, thought Marian. What's her name? It's either Jennifer or Ashley. He's all grown up now. In half an hour, she said to her son. And he nodded, showing that he had heard his mother's words. It was cool in the spacious cabin. Jacob and Robert were sitting in the living room playing chess, as usual. We're going home in 3 days, and you haven't even burned, Marian sighed. She gently ruffled her husband's hair and kissed her father on the cheek. Don't worry, Marian, he replied. We'll make it. How is the sea? The water is warm, replied Marian. How's the game? A draw, replied father with a sigh. After all, Robert adopts from me not only the nuances of managing the company, but also the ability to play chess. Robert smiled. I learned from the best, Jacob, he said to his father-in-law. Checkmate to you, by the way. Oh, you, Jacob cursed. Grandfather Molly appeared out of nowhere. What does that mean? She asked. Jacob coughed embarrassedly. It means, young lady, he said with feigned sternness, that you're not legally allowed to say that for another 8 years. We have worse swearing at school, Molly said, laughing and running off to the shower. Change schools, Jacob said firmly. I won't have my only granddaughter using that kind of language. Marian walked over to her father and kissed him on the top of his head. Then you'll have to change Grandpa, she said, because he's the one Molly hears it most often. That's a fair point, sighed her father. That's a fair point, Dad sighed. I'll try not to swear so much." Marian smiled and looked out to sea. Through the transparent panoramic wall of their cottage, she could see the huge red sun slipping into the sunset. "It's nice," she said, turning to Robert, who came over and hugged her from behind. "I always feel good with you," replied her husband. "Me too," said Marian. "And I'm perfectly happy."
Jessica didn't want to go to the notary, especially since Brian's got no one to leave him with. 7 years old. He's a young fiance, but he's still scared. Where are we going? The store or the park? That's where I'd like to go. There are squirrels, ducks, wild swans, Brian asked on the way. Jessica smiled. "No, son. We're going to my uncle the notary for Grandpa Matthew's inheritance." "But my dad's." "Oh, I see. Well, not really, of course. Is Grandpa Matthew already in heaven?" Brian asked again. Jessica shrugged. "I guess so. Never did anything bad to anyone. Helped orphanages, homeless animals." Brian nodded in agreement, but he continued the conversation. And his grandfather made homeless dogs with these collars yellow. But it means that the dog is vaccinated, does not pose a threat to people. And he doesn't just walk around town, he walks near the shelter. Brian thought dreamily, imagining that someday he would have a dog of his own. Jessica, on the other hand, was thinking about something else, about her upcoming conversation with the notary. What could she possibly learn there? Especially when her daddy wouldn't come back, and that was the most painful topic for her. Why does she need all this business now? Especially since she had always dreamed of linking her life with a beauty salon, or at the very least, a restaurant. And here is a construction company, its own peculiarities, many of which remained unclear to her. On the other hand, there's no escape. You have to enter into the rites. That's the procedure. And what a bad time it was. One thing on top of another, like a series of troubles. Then there's the divorce from Eden. The husband has shown his true colors. No sooner had Daddy gone than he took a mistress. Openly, brazenly. He wouldn't do that in Matthew's time. He was afraid. It's understandable. A lot of people were afraid of Matthew. What's character alone? And his business acumen. He'd take a man by the throat as well as any opponent. But all in good time. A month ago, Matthew died, and Jessica and her stepmother Kayla learned the tragic news. A sudden heart attack, overwork, business trips, negotiations, and endless business trips. All for home. All for family. Jessica sighed sadly and crossed to the other side of the street, where the notary's office was actually located. At the best of times she could have used a car, but at the moment she had no such option. Shortly before Matthew's tragic passing, his previously established business had suffered a setback. Jessica had to sell her car to help her father to pay off his debts. Of course, she didn't regret selling the car. Without it, she could live quite normally. And it wasn't the main thing. Jessica was brought out of her sad thoughts by Brian's voice. "Mommy, look, there's Daddy's car. The red one, the one that..." Jessica flinched and looked in that direction. That's right, Eden's foreign car. He never spared money to buy them. He liked to live lavishly. Who's embarrassed? He used to be afraid of his father-in-law, but now he's not afraid of anything. Ignoring her son's remark, Jessica started up the stairs. Brian followed obediently, still not fully understanding what was going on. But when Jessica opened the door of the notary's office, she was stunned to see her Eden standing in front of her, embraced by another long-legged beauty. Jessie was here, And here we are like a Christmas tree, early riser, early riser. I can see that. It's a good idea to get up at someone else's expense, said Jessica. Eden sniffed resentfully. Why should it be at someone else's expense? Your father left me something too. I've lived with you for 5 years. More like lived. Yeah, well, it doesn't matter. So your daddy decided to thank me for putting up with his no-good daughter for so many years. My mom's not a bad mom, but you're a traitor, Brian exclaimed and stomped his foot angrily. Eden smirked. He's growing up to be a protector. I told you from the start, kids from the orphanage will never be family. Jessica gave her husband a hateful look. Who's pulling your tongue? Don't you have anyone to talk to? Brian is my son, period. I don't care what you think. But it's your business, and I always speak my mind. Know that you and your daddy were playing spy, thinking up combinations. So you did, Eden said with undisguised irony. His companion hummed in agreement and gave Jessica a scornful look. How dare you talk about my father like that? If it weren't for him, you'd still be working as a construction laborer. Who made you foreman? Who taught you everything? Jessica exclaimed. The situation in the notary's office was getting heated, and the conversation was about to turn into a real scandal at any moment. At that moment, the door of the office opened, and the elderly notary took the role of umpire. Citizens stopped quarreling. I dare say that the notary's office is the least suitable for such scenes, although I understand the condition of both parties. Therefore, to avoid further and unnecessary speculations, I will say everything at once. Matthew Skorobogatov left his entire business and financial assets to Eden Prudnikov and the deceased's wife, Kayla Starbogatova. Jessica has left all real estate, including a beach house. Out of surprise, Jessica froze in place like a dumbfounded woman. Apparently, the experienced notary had deliberately laid out everything at once in order to put an end to family squabbles in one fell swoop. What do you mean all the business and assets? To whom? To that womanizer and philanderer, Jessica exclaimed, her cheeks flushed with excitement. You must mean you, sweetheart. You're nothing now. And my Eden is a rich heir, Olivia said. Eden grinned and looked at his ex-wife defiantly. They weren't technically separated yet, but it was only a matter of time. Her father's premature departure had prevented Jessica from realizing what she'd planned. She had wanted to divorce Eden 6 months ago, but it never came to fruition. It was one thing or the other. But by that time, they were no longer living together, and everyone realized that they would never have a strong family relationship. And now Jessica found out that her beloved father left all his savings to Eden. That's unthinkable. What was the dead businessman's motive? He couldn't do that to his daughter, could he? Maybe Matthew was hypnotized, or worse, coerced. Jessica didn't know the answer to that question. It's Jessica, why don't you say something? You're entitled to something too. Your late father has not forgotten about you, said the notary's voice. Jessica looked up and met the older man's gaze. What am I owed? Paul adjusted his horn-rimmed glasses on his nose and answered in an impartial tone. You will be given a house in the village of Michaelville, along with the surrounding land and outbuildings. And there was a tense pause in the office. It seemed that even the secretary had stopped tapping on the keyboard. At first, Jessica thought she had misheard and misunderstood Paul's words. But when she asked again, her mood sank. God, what was my father thinking when he made his will? Raced through the young woman's mind, not realizing which cabin she was referring to. So Brian clung to his mom and looked at everyone present in a huff. "Are you happy with your inheritance? Did Daddy please you or not?" Eden asked with a sneer. "He did, Eden. I'm sure he did," Jessica said in a shaky voice. Her ex-husband smirked. "You probably haven't even seen that house." "I have. It was a sight to behold. I'll tell you, the house was just about to fall apart like a house of cards. Caution in the yard, well, not unlike our inheritance. But I'm glad you like it." "All right, let's go," Jessica said in a shaky voice, and taking the package with the deed and keys from the notary's desk, she left the office with Brian. On the street, she covered her face with her hands and cried softly. "What are you doing? Why are you crying? Is everything okay? Or are you upset because of this house?" the baby asked anxiously. Jessica shook her head sadly. What could she say to her son that his grandfather had left them without an inheritance? Yes, she couldn't even believe it herself. How could a little child get into that? Jessica was sure her daddy was going to leave his estate to her. And he even gave his real estate to Kayla. She lived with him for 10 years? Not very long, if you ask me. She waited her time. What's she and Brian gonna do? Jessica couldn't live with her stepmother. And it was Kayla's fault she didn't like her stepdaughter at first sight. Jessica had never sought conflict with the femme fatale. If her father chose her, he knew what he was doing. He was guided by something. So after living in Matthew's house for about a year, Kayla began to gradually establish her own rules. First, she forced Jessica out of the kitchen, preventing her from cooking. "I'm sorry, darling, but I'm bored with your cooking. Why stand at the stove 24 hours a day when you can pay for restaurant delivery?" Kayla said, letting Jessica know that her presence was unwelcome. Jessica looked hopefully at her dad, but he pretended not to notice and continued to do what he was very good, running his business. Jessica, on the other hand, was in charge of his charities and helping anyone in need. She didn't remember the road from the notary's office very well. What was she thinking? What was she planning? No one could tell but herself. Brian obediently walked beside her, trying not to bother his mother with questions. The clever boy realized that something strange had happened this morning that would change their lives beyond recognition. And when Jessica opened the door to her parents' house, she felt uneasy. The thing was that in the living room, she saw a strange man in his 50s, with whom her stepmother was talking like a lovebird. And after all, it had only been a month since her father had left. But how could this be? Insolent, cynical, no respect for the feelings of the deceased. When she saw Jessica, Kayla struggled to suppress a snide grin. For a moment she thought her stepmother knew about the will, and that's why she was acting so brazen and defiant. Look, she's built a romantic rendezvous here. Wine, a dish from the restaurant on the table. I guess the inheritance is impressive, Jessica thought. Then she added, turning to Brian. Son, we're leaving. Pack your things in your backpack, and I'll take care of the suitcases. The boy looked at his mom in surprise. Leaving? Where to? Michaelville Township, where Grandpa left us an inheritance. Well, what else is there to do? Jessica replied in a shaky voice. Brian nodded and then ran to his room to pack. Are you guys going somewhere? Kayla asked in a slightly surprised voice. Yeah, we're leaving. There's nothing more to do here. Oh, is there anything I can do for you? Maybe call a cab? Or something? The stepmother persisted. No, thanks. Am I so stupid that I can't call my own cab? Jessica snapped at her. It took them about half an hour to pack. Jessica felt like she was being mean to herself and to the circumstances that forced her to look at the situation from a different angle. She had thought her father would leave her the business and all the financial assets. That's what everyone does. All best for the children and grandchildren. But here everything went in a completely different scenario. Instead of helping his own daughter, Matthew gave everything to his deadbeat son-in-law. Maybe it's because he always wanted a son, so he saw Eden as his successor. He couldn't think of a worse candidate for that role. Chasing the sad thoughts away, Jessica picked up her suitcase and headed for the exit, where an elderly cab driver in an unremarkable yellow foreign car was waiting for them. "We're going to Michaelville, please. I'll give you the number." "Okay, sure. Have a seat, please." "I'll make it all right," the driver fussed. Jessica nodded and got into the back passenger seat with Brian. She knew where the village she wanted was, about 30 kilometers from the city. A river, a small forest, and vast fields where the local farmers' land spread out. Brian nestled his face against the window, watching the road. And every time a huge truck drove by, he ahead in delight. In truth, the kid had never been out of town before, so his amazement was so genuine that Jessica couldn't help but smile. "Are you going to Mikhailovsky at all, or are you just visiting?" the cab driver asked. Jessica shrugged uncertainly. "I don't know, as it turns out. Maybe for good." The driver exclaimed in amazement. "I've been there many times. You can't find a better place for recreation, mushrooms, fishing, and the land is such that everything grows, no matter what you plant, honestly. And we're not really tied to the land. I studied pedagogy." "But I never worked a day at school," Jessica said, embarrassed. "My dad wanted to make a businesswoman out of me, but it didn't work out. But it's fixable. It's just a matter of will, as they say." "Yeah, it's okay. We'll come and see, and then we'll see," Jessica summarized. The road ran away like a ribbon fluttering in the wind. There was a turn here, a fork there. They didn't reach the village until the afternoon. The locals met the unremarkable cab car warily. And after all, the settlement was relatively small, and every new guest was an occasion for discussion and detailed scrutiny. So when Jessica saw the same type of local houses with stone roofs and small windows, she was visibly dejected. But she had imagined it a little differently. Dogs roamed the yards, and geese lazily nibbled at the grass. Skinny chickens pecked at their feed, in no hurry to get anywhere. When the cab driver called the right house number, Jessica froze with surprise. Eden hadn't been lying when he'd said the house looked old and dilapidated from years of neglect. "What, are we going to live here now?" Brian asked in amazement. "And son, not only living, but probably working." "Well, at least I am," Jessica said, which surprised the old cab driver. "If you need anything, just ask. I'll leave you my number just in case," the driver said and held out a folded notebook. "Thank you," Jessica replied, and then paid the fare. Fortunately, the driver helped her carry her heavy suitcases to the door of the house. "Don't let it go to waste," Brian shouted after the man. "Come again." Jessica smiled and was about to put the key in the keyhole when the door opened. Brian jumped in surprise and backed away. "Who lives there?" he asked. But Jessica couldn't answer his question. She didn't know who was hiding in the semi-darkness of the hallway, and how to understand it. "Or I'll call the police," she exclaimed, trying to make her voice sound threatening. She was answered only by a slightly audible old man's laughter, and then a weak male voice said, "Come on, honey. What kind of police are there when there is only one policeman for the whole neighborhood? If you call him, you'll be waiting till the evening, or maybe even until the next morning as luck would have it." "Who are you, Grandpa? a house elf, Brian beat his mom to the punch. The old man laughed. Well, my friend, I'm not a housekeeper. I'm Roger, the former headmaster of the village school, and now I'm a retired man, living out my life in this house. Jessica turned pale. What about the inheritance? But it's my late Daddy Matthew's house. I've got the deeds to it, and the keys, and it's all legal. Roger finally came out of the darkness of the house. He turned out to be a puny man in his 80s. Is Matthew dead? I don't know anything about that. Oh God, it's a shame about the heartbreaker. He was such a good man, kind, fair. Seeing that tears were streaming down the man's cheeks, Jessica cautiously asked, "Did you know my dad personally?" Roger shook his head sadly. Of course I did, and not only knew him. I was his father instead of his father. I taught him math at school, then algebra and geometry. The Matthew always had a clear head. God rest his soul. You must be his daughter. Jessica was visibly embarrassed. Yes, Roger. My name is Jessica, and this is my son Brian. The older man's face brightened. What a good boy. You can tell he's just like his grandfather. He's gonna grow up smart. I know what I'm talking about. In the old days, I used to be able to recognize a student's abilities at a glance. Thank you. It's our pleasure, Jessica said discreetly, not wanting to tell her grandfather that Brian was her adopted son, not her own. It was a hot topic, and she didn't want to talk about it in front of someone she didn't know. Don't worry about it. I'll be out of the house tonight, so as not to disturb you and Brienne. Matthew let me stay here for a while. But I guess I've been here too long. It's time to do the honors, Roger added, and went to pack his things. At that moment, Jessica felt a sharp prick of conscience. It wasn't right to kick a man out of his house when he had nowhere else to go. Wait, Roger, don't go. Stay with us. If Dad wanted you to live here, then so be it. The older man looked at Jessica doubtfully. Oh, come on, you'll say that too. You and your family are going to live here, aren't you? Why do you need such a burden in the form of a decrepit old man? I've got one thing going on and one thing going on. And how's your husband gonna take it? Why do you need an extra mouth? Although I do get pension, and not the smallest, by the way. So if anything I can help, I won't be a freeloader. Well, that's great. If you don't mind, you can stay for good. We don't know anyone in the village. You'll be a guide for us, Jessica summarized with a smile, tactfully avoiding the question about her spouse. Or what could she say? Still not divorced from her unfaithful husband, who on top of that was trying to grab her father's inheritance. No, Jessica had no legal issues. And why would she have any when everything was legal? Thank you, Penelope, kind soul sheltered, did not let go to die. My daughter-in-law threw me out of the house after the death of my son. Well, not immediately, of course, gradually. First she evicted me from my room to the living room, forced me to move, then to the summer kitchen. And then the road to vagrancy was open. What a disgrace, former headmaster. I was retired until my health failed, Roger lamented. Jessica frowned. How could an old man be kicked out of his house like that? Couldn't you go to the police? Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. Or the township council. Roger just waved his hand. Come on, Jessica. What's the point of wasting time on this? I've had a lot on my mind lately, and I don't blame my sister-in-law. God is her judge. Thanks for letting see her once in a while. She wanted to put me in a home for charity, but for old people like me. Anyway, I refused. I can't do without my kids, Every year on September 1st, I come and cry. I look at them and cry. Why are you crying, Grandpa? Do you have a pain? Or don't you like school? Brian asked. Roger smiled and brushed away the tears. It's because I'm happy, grandson, that the kids are going to school. When I see school uniforms, it makes my heart ache. They wanted to disband our school 5 years ago, saying it was too old, but I stood up for it. I even went to the region. I wrote a complaint and a petition. Thanks to the late Matthew, he helped me with transportation. He was a good man. Jessica looked at the older theme with respect, and then suggested that he go inside. To her great surprise, the inside was clean, not a speck of dust, no cobwebs or odor, and the kitchen was clean and scrubbed, just like before the inspection, Jessica thought, and such perfect order made her envious. Brian also liked the house, which seemed to him like the home of a good wizard from a fairy tale. As it turned out later, Roger had been hiding in a tiny room all this time, shy of occupying the whole house. What about work? Can you find anything suitable at all? Jessica asked. Well, it depends on what you need, what you're passionate about. I mean, you can go to the post office, or you can get a job on a farm as a milkmaid or a poultry farmer. If you're educated, go to school. Jessica was short of teachers. That's why the new principal keeps talking about disbanding the school, as if he didn't realize that not everyone in the family has transportation to get there. Roger said he did it. School. That works for me. True, I have never worked in my field. But did you spend all those years studying pedagogy for nothing? Jessica said with a smile. Wow. My mom's going to be a teacher, shrieked Brian. That's a big deal. I think you'd be very welcome at the local school, said Roger. Well, that remains to be seen. Maybe they won't hire me, or I might not be able to work. You never know. Roger smiled, and then began setting the table to feed his guests. He'd made some potatoes and cucumber and tomato salad before they arrived. Of course, it's not God knows what, but it's good for when your stomach is rumbling with hunger. Here you are, all your own from the garden. Even though it's small, it's still a breadwinner. I take care of the land, feed it in the fall with manure and humus. That's how I make a meal at one time, and I have food for the whole week. How much do I need there? A couple of potatoes, a cucumber. That's all we have to worry about in the country, said Roger. Oh, it's delicious, Grandpa Roger. It's delicious, Brian said with his mouth full. So the old man smiled. Eat. You need your strength. You're so thin. Your grandfather Matthew was just like that, though. And he got stronger in high school and started working out on the bar. Jessica lowered her eyes again in embarrassment. No, she considered Brian her own son, period. There couldn't even be any talk about it. She'd taken the baby from an orphanage just under 7 years ago. The newborn Brian's mother had given him up for some reason. And Jessica had long dreamed of having a baby. In fact, the doctors gave her their verdict 3 years ago, when the examination revealed that she would not be able to have children. The decision to adopt little Brian Jessica had to make almost alone. After all, there was no hope for Eden's support. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Brian had suffered nerve damage in his leg at birth, which could leave him with a limp for the rest of his life. But if you want him so badly, I won't mind. But why would you want a limp? Can't you get someone normal? Eden said with contempt in his voice. But aren't you ashamed to say that? He's still so young. Don't you have any compassion in your heart? Jessica said with tears in her eyes. I have compassion, but only for myself. Who's going to take care of me? That's right, no one. You, for example, are ready to take care of some defective boy instead of worrying about me, objected her husband. Of course, Jessica suspected at once that she would not find support in his spies, but to do such a thing was unthinkable. What are you, a child? Can't you take care of yourself? It's a child, you know, it needs help, maybe even corrective surgery, Jessica exclaimed. But if that's what you need, then go ahead. I've got other things to do, Eden said, and slammed the door. To Jessica's credit, she accomplished what she intended to do, which was to get custody of 3-month-old Brian. Subsequently, she showed the boy to one of the best specialists in the field of pediatric orthopedics and pediatric surgery, thanks to which the baby was able to finally get rid of his disease. Throughout this time, Jessica never told Brian that he was adopted. Why unnecessarily upset him, especially when Jessica loved him with all her heart and considered him her closest, dearest family member. The late Matthew Skorobogatov took his daughter's decision with restraint, but with understanding. He himself also dreamed of a grandson, and therefore was happy little Brian as his own. Hey, Papa, why did you leave an inheritance to that traitor? Where, pray tell, did your eyes look? Jessica thought sadly, after she had washed the dishes and cleared the table. She had no idea that her unfaithful husband Eden was thinking the same thing at that very moment. That was a good one. Did your father-in-law sign over the whole business to me, Eden? Asked his new mistress Olivia with a smile. The girl looked into his eyes with surprise. Yes, I can't say otherwise. And I'll be honest, how did you do it? Olivia asked. Eden smiled enigmatically. How did I do it? Simple. I shared it with the notary and intercepted Skorobogatov's will. He gave it to me himself. He was dying. He relied on me. I guess he saw me as his son. But I didn't hesitate. I made the most of my chance. I forged a signature on the will and got the notary to nail me. Olivia looked at him in surprise. But how did you do it, and why did the notary agree? I mean, it's illegal. Well, how I did it. It's simple. The notary's son had a traffic accident. Anyway, he was facing criminal punishment. The accident was high profile. The investigation found him guilty, and I managed to get a video of the license lie. What recorder? The girl didn't understand. Eden sighed unhappily. You're just like a little girl. A video recorder that takes pictures of the road. Yes, every second driver has one. And here I was lucky enough to find a witness to the accident. I bought the tape and presented it to a notary. And he agreed. Olivia wouldn't let it go. So where was he supposed to go? The tape was the main bargaining chip in the case against his son. He showed the tape in court. They dropped all the charges against the kid. But the real culprit of the accident got away. You can see it on the video. Eden looked at Olivia with a smile. She's a nice girl after all, slender. It makes my heart grow fonder, he thought. And what do you plan to do with your father-in-law's capital? Austin asked cautiously. I don't know yet. Most likely I'll sell the business for more money. And I'll put the money in a bank account to earn interest. You're a great strategist and thinker, Olivia said proudly. What did you think? Eden smiled. At that moment he felt like the master of his life. He'd done a good job of getting the rich man to come to the right place at the right time, and he had solved the problem of the will drastically, without unnecessary words and paperwork. Eden didn't even think about why his father-in-law trusted him on his deathbed. Was there really no other choice? Eden wrote it off as the effects of the painkillers, which the deceased could no longer do without, despite the fact that Jessica slept very poorly in her new place. After breakfast, she decided to visit the local school and talk about the job. Of course, she realized that it was summer, and she might not be enrolled on staff until September at best. But on the other hand, having a conversation on the subject clearly couldn't hurt. And she understood that as well as anyone. Ashley's headmaster was wary of her visit, as if expecting a catch. Why would this city fashionista want to infiltrate his staff? What if it was for testing purposes? They love that kind of thing. Oh, they do. And Ashley didn't want to lose his chair. He's the boss, and he's a big deal in this town. Everyone wants to say hello and bow to you when they meet you. The director looked at the documents and thought for a moment. On the one hand, he could easily refuse, because it was not a problem to find a reason. On the other hand, he was afraid he would make a possible enemy of her. No, I'd rather have her working under my supervision than spreading rumors back in town. And then they'll send an inspection, and then they'll find out that the funds for school repairs are being misused. Ashley thought and then said, addressing Jessica, "Well, I don't doubt your diploma and education. I think you'll fit in well with our team. And to help you get used to it, I suggest you work, so to speak, with the special contingent." "What special contingent?" Jessica was surprised. "We have a boy here, Scott. He's a sophomore. For failing grades, Scott lives with his wheelchair-bound dad. His leg's been missing since a car accident. Tractor driver was at fault. Now he's quit, so his dad's on his own. Of course, we help the whole village as much as we can." "What's that got to do with me?" Jessica didn't get the hint. Ashley grimaced. "I'd like you to give Scott a few extra lessons so that he'll be more prepared for the next school year." "Is that what you're saying?" "That would be fine." "I don't mind. We'll get started as soon as you say so," Jessica said with a sigh of relief. "But good. I don't think we should wait too long. Anyway, let's get started today. I'll let Scott's dad know. Why don't you wait in room 7? Okay, he'll be here in no time. He lives nearby." Jessica shrugged and, accepting the principal's suggestion, went out into the hallway. Fortunately, she didn't have to wait long. Soon, a panting schoolboy flew into the office, a folder with notebooks in his hands. "Hello, may I? Is this where the extra credit classes are held?" "Yes, Scott. Not for repeaters, but for underachievers. That's more appropriate. My name is Jessica Andreevna, and I'd like to start the lesson now." "Show us where we left off. Or rather, before we went on vacation," Jessica began in a pleasant, cheerful voice. Scott nodded in agreement and immediately showed the correct page in his textbook. As she watched the boy solve the problems and answer the questions, Jessica realized that he wasn't as stupid as the headmistress was trying to make him out to be. Not only that, but Scott's knowledge was about average, so he didn't deserve to be retained at all. So what's the point? Who is bothering this sweet and quiet boy? Determined to find out from Scott herself, Jessica cautiously began her questioning. At first he'd been withdrawn and refused to talk about it. But then, when Jessica began to talk about herself and her life, he became more open and animated. "My classmates laugh at me. They say my dad is a legless pirate, but he's not a pirate. Dad's a good guy, you know. He could have collided with a car, but he swerved and fell into a ditch with his tractor. He lost his legs. Well, I don't think your daddy's bad. On the contrary, if you don't mind, I can visit him after school. I have a son about your age. Right now, he's at home with Grandpa Eric." "Is that okay?" asked Jessica as gently as possible. Jessica asked, "It's okay, but Daddy doesn't like visitors, but they'll probably let you guys in. He doesn't like the principal much. I fight a lot." "They come to my house," agreed the boy. "Why do you fight, Scott?" "It's bad. It doesn't do any good. It only gets you decent behavior, the boy explained. I'm protecting my daddy from people who make fun of him. He's a good carpenter. He makes different caskets so that you can't take your eyes off them. Well, that's interesting. A boy as smart as you can't have a bad daddy, Jessica said with a smile as she taught Scott a total of 4 lessons. She was pleasantly surprised by his knowledge. No, he's definitely not staying for a second year, but we'll work on his behavior, she thought on the way to Scott's house. As it turned out, the boy lived in a house on the very edge of the village. It didn't look much different from the one Jessica had lived in not so long ago. And when she saw the young man in a wheelchair, she was visibly embarrassed and slowed down. What, son, did you mess up again? Matthew, accustomed to such behavior, asked with concern in his voice. No, Dad, it's Jessica, our new teacher. She's in town with her son, Scott exclaimed happily. Oh, well, come in then. I've just boiled the kettle, the landlord said, changing from anger to mercy. Jessica smiled and accepted the offer. Truth be told, she hadn't expected Scott's father to be such a sweet and pleasant man to talk to. Matthew had been emphatically polite and hadn't tried to favor his son or denigrate the school authorities for keeping him in the second year. Sneaking a moment, the man said quietly, My Scott's having a hard time. He gets insulted by everybody. It's understandable. I'm the reason they make fun of me for being legless, but it's only temporary. I'm saving up for prosthetics, the best kind, so I can feel human again. Jessica looked at Matthew sympathetically. I understand, and I'll help Scott, and I'll talk to the principal. It's not right. He's going to get whipped. Scott returned to the kitchen to continue the tea party. Unbeknownst to Jessica, Matthew was a very kind, good man. He didn't press for pity, didn't want to be sympathized with or made concessions. Not like Eden from Snowy, selfish, only thinking about himself, Jessica thought to herself. Matthew had already told her about his past life, when he had been a tractor driver, and was considered one of the most important people in the village. There's no place in the village without a tractor. If snow's in the winter, you'll never dig it out with a shovel, he said with a glint in his eyes. Jessica sat for a while longer and started to get ready to go home. At that moment, the cell phone in the young teacher's pocket vibrated, informing her that she had an incoming call. And when she saw the caller's name on the screen, Jessica cringed. It was Eden, and what does he want? Did he really miss me and decided to call? Jessica thought and decided not to answer. What were they going to talk about? Pouring from empty to empty? The news about the inheritance? But it was clear enough. Eden beat her to it. Well, let him enjoy his moments of fame and fortune. It's his right. A winner's right. To Jessica's surprise, Eden was not satisfied with one call and repeated the call several more times. Why don't you answer it? What if it's important? Matthew natted. Jessica shook her head. No, I don't want to. He's my ex-husband, even though we weren't divorced yet. So Matthew nodded sympathetically, then walked her to the gate, deftly shifting the wheels of the wheelchair with his hands. He tried to appear normal and not to focus on his illness. God, how unfair life can be. Why did he have to go through all this? Such a nice guy, Jessica thought. She waved goodbye to Matthew and Scott and walked down the street toward her house. From a distance, Jessica spotted a red foreign car that she'd obviously seen before. No, it couldn't be. But could it be again? As she got closer, she realized this car definitely belonged to Eden. Jessica was suddenly nervous. She didn't want to see her ex-husband, even though they were still legally married. She heard Eden's distinctive voice, which she couldn't confuse with anyone else's. Her ex-husband was being defiant and shouting at an illegitimate son who had had the misfortune to go out into the yard. Roger tried to stand up for the boy, but of course he couldn't stand up to Eden. The businessman was furious, and Jessica realized it at once. As soon as she opened the gate, she was confronted by her ex-husband. Ah, there you are, Jessica. Just what I need. I don't know who I've been asking. What's this got to do with anything? Why did you come here? Jessica exclaimed. Eden grinned. You're still asking? Do you know that your father deceived me? Jessica turned pale. What do you mean, cheated? What are you talking about? Are you out of your mind? It was you who got everything in the will, and I got nothing. Have you forgotten? No, dearie, I haven't forgotten. But your father was always up to tricks. He had it all worked out in advance, so that's why he emptied the company's accounts just before he left. And his business is on the verge of bankruptcy. What? Are you telling me you didn't know about this? Eden growled. Jessica's eyes showed genuine bewilderment. Of course not. Did you think otherwise? Eden shook his head sorrowfully. You're a liar, just like your father. You were all liars. They'd have to think of something like that. You've outplayed me wherever you can. Remember, I'm not going to let this go. If you don't return the money your father hid in secret accounts, you'll regret it, Eden said threateningly. Are you threatening me? What does this have to do with me? This is the first time I've ever heard this from you, Jessica said tearfully. But Eden was not convinced. On the contrary, he acted as if Jessica knew what her father was up to. After an effective pause, Eden said something that made her uncomfortable. If you don't find the money, you're on your own. You hear me? I'll make sure Brian's in an orphanage, and you'll be disenfranchised. Yeah, don't look at me like that. It'll be just like I said. At this point, Roger, who had been standing quite peacefully on the sidelines until then, intervened. I don't think you've chosen the right tactics. Young man, threatening a woman, and a young mother at that, is unthinkable. Eden's lips curled in a sneer. Who the hell is this grandfather? Is he a protector? He's a good one. He's only capable of grumbling. In fact, just look for the money. If you don't, Brian's going straight to an orphanage. I don't want to go to an orphanage. Dad, why are you doing this? And why are you hurting Mom? Brian exclaimed with resentment. I'm not your father. What are you talking about? Do we have anything in common? Eden left and headed for his car, where, as it turned out, his mistress Olivia was sitting. Jessica was so shocked by her ex-husband's confession that she couldn't say a word. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, and her hands were trembling as if after a nervous shock. What's the matter, Sharon? Don't take it personally. He's lying. I'm telling you, he wouldn't have the guts to do something like that. He's a small-time bastard. I've seen a few of those in my time. He's a threat, especially to women, Roger said in a low voice. Thank you for your support. It means a lot to me, Jessica whispered. But the older man just waved his hand. Oh, really? Thank you. What if that boar shows up again? Jessica calmed down a little and looked at the situation with different eyes. It seemed that her late father had bequeathed a loss-making business to Eden without any financial support. But then where had the money from his accounts gone? After all, Eden had inherited a bankrupt firm with a lot of debts and problems on top of that. Jessica, of course, had known her father was a good businessman before, so he'd always had the upper hand. But this was beyond her comprehension. Such a masterful combination. Matthew had done the impossible. Jessica, however, was neither hot nor cold about it. She had no idea where her father's money was really kept, and there were no people who could give her a definite answer. So how was your first day at work? Were you already at the table? Roger asked. Jessica smiled. I think so. I met Scott and his dad, Artem, the one who used to be a tractor driver. Roger's face brightened. I know him. A good guy. It's just a pity that life treated him so unfairly. He was, in fact, a victim of circumstances. If he hadn't turned the wheel, he wouldn't have saved the car and probably would have been less injured. Jessica sighed sadly. To tell the truth, she felt sorry for Artem, who had gotten into such a difficult situation. But what could she do? Nothing, really, except help Scott with his studies so that the boy could properly prepare for September 1st. The thought of Scott made her heart warm. A kind, intelligent boy. He's a joy to look at. The principal's good too. Put him in the 2nd grade. No, that won't do, Jessica said. If Jessica only knew that the principal was thinking the same thing right now. Ashley had been working in the field for years, so he was afraid of anything that could even indirectly harm him. Most of all, he was afraid of any inspection that could lead him to a cottage in the suburbs, which was being built with some of the materials allocated for the school renovation. To tell the truth, Ashley was quite satisfied that in the near future the school would be disbanded, and he himself would be transferred to the district school. He didn't care how Scott, whose dad didn't have his own car, would get there. Eden, on the other hand, was in real trouble. The late Matthew had cleverly caught him on the hook when he asked his son-in-law to deliver the will to the notary. The experienced businessman immediately noticed a mysterious glint in his eyes and decided to take a big risk. As a consequence, Eden was faced with problems that he had never even suspected before. The creditors of the deceased demanded payment of debts, and competitors were ready to take the firm for nothing. So Eden found himself in a desperate situation in the true sense of the word. Now that he'd inherited the inheritance, all the strings were tied to him, and to play the situation back he could not, because he himself forged the will in the hope of appropriating the assets of the deceased businessman. But in reality, everything turned out quite differently. The accounts of the firm were completely empty, and all the employees of the company only helplessly waved their hands. That's when Eden realized that he had fallen into a real trap, one from which he could not get out alone. Naturally, he wasn't going to file for Jessica's termination of parental rights. So what would be the point, when she probably didn't know anything about the whereabouts of the money? 3 days passed, during which Jessica studied with Scott additionally and visited his father. With Jessica's arrival, Artem was noticeably more animated, his eyes lighting up with joy. He seemed to come out of his stupor, began to joke and smile. To Jessica's joy, the changes affected not only Artem, but also his son. Gradually, Scott turned from an insecure child into a confident boy, who was no longer afraid of circumstances and life's problems. Perhaps that's what the boy lacked, self-confidence and support. I believe you will succeed. And do not pay attention to your classmates. Soon they will envy you and consider you a leader. Just don't give up. Keep studying. And also please be restrained and don't rush to use your fists, Jessica said with feeling. I'll do my best during recess, Jessica Scott replied. And I don't know how long I'll be able to do it, but I'll keep at it, he said modestly. Seeing that the new teacher was not a threat to him, the headmaster relaxed. Now he was no longer afraid of the inspection and could continue to build his cottage in the suburbs overlooking the lake. Eden, fighting the avalanche of problems, left Jessica alone for a while, and she was glad. One day, coming home from work, she noticed a black SUV parked at the gate. Is Eden back again? Why is it in a different car? Where did the money for such purchase come from? Did he sell his father's firm for nothing? Jessica thought. But when the young teacher came closer, a gray-haired man in his 50s with the appearance of an office clerk came out to meet her. Jessica, the stranger asked. Yes, it's me. What's up? The man smiled and immediately switched to an informal tone of conversation. I am your late father Matthew's attorney. The fact is that he has instructed me to hand over to you personally the details of the accounts where the money is kept. The accounts are completely transparent and the tax authorities will have no problem with them. The money is intended for you personally and has nothing to do with your husband. Jessica corrected in a muffled voice. Yes, the X. I don't mind the wording. I also have an envelope to give you. I don't know what it contains, but it was given to me by your father shortly before he died. And it was Matthew who set the date for you and I to meet. Not a day sooner, not a day later, the office clerk summarized. Felix took the packet of business documents with bank account details with a trembling hand. Jessica placed the envelope in the side pocket of her blouse to open a little later. To having accomplished his mission, the man politely said goodbye and got into the car. Jessica, on woozy legs, walked over to the bench, leaning on one side, and opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from Daddy, which began with the following words. My dear daughter, if you are reading these lines, it means that I am no longer alive. So I apologize in advance for this whole show with the will, but I could not do otherwise. I had to set the record straight to expose your husband Eden. With my will in his hands, I'm 99% sure he'll try to fake it and turn the situation in his favor. Fortunately, I've taken care of that, and Eden is out of the woods. I put him in charge of an unprofitable business that will only bring trouble and the realization of the mistake he made in betraying you. I'm leaving you with savings most people can't even dream of. Spend it wisely for the benefit of yourself and your grandson, Brian. Your Papa Matthew. Sitting on the bench, Jessica reread what she had written over and over again. My God, is it really true? She thought. Tears ran down her cheeks when she found a picture at the bottom of the envelope. A picture of herself as a child, wearing a light daisy dress and barefoot sandals. Why are you crying? Did something happen? Did your father hurt you again? The son came up from behind and asked anxiously. Jessica turned around and a sweet smile played on her lips. Oh no, Brian, really? It's okay. It's just that we won't be poor anymore and we'll be able to do anything we want to succeed. Wow. Can we build a store here? Like in the city. And a playground and a water park for sure. The boy exclaimed happily. Of course we can. We just have to wait a little longer, Jessica replied. From that day on, their lives really changed. First of all, Jessica sent some of the money for the renovation of the village school, which upset the headmaster. Thanks to Jessica's intervention, all the machinations of Ashley, who thought only about his own profit, were revealed. After learning that the school would get a second chance, Roger could not hold back his tears, hugging Jessica. The elderly man cried and thanked fate for bringing him together with the daughter of the late Matthew. Jessica didn't forget about Jack, who had received an invitation to one of the best prosthetic centers. Jessica, thank you so much. I don't even know how to thank you, the man said with barely contained excitement. She smiled and looked at Scott looking out the window. Well, who was right? That's right, me. And no one else, Jessica said. As Scott smiled back and ran outside to hug his favorite teacher. Tears sprang from Jessica's eyes as the little boy expressed his gratitude. Since Ashley had been fired right after his shenanigans had been exposed, it was only natural to wonder who would be the new principal. And that's where the villagers were in unanimous agreement, Jessica, no one else. No, what do you mean? I don't have any experience. I've only just joined the staff, Jessica whispered embarrassedly. Roger was more than persistent. Go for it, Jessica, don't be stubborn. There's no better director. You are just made for this job. People trust you. You have allocated so much money for personal repairs. Jessica smiled embarrassed and then thanked everyone for their trust. Wow, my mom's the principal now, Brian squealed happily. As Jessica cut him off, don't get too excited, buddy. I'm not going to let you off the hook. Don't count on it. I'm going to ask you for your material just like everybody else. Learning is light, and unlearning is darkness. Scott said with a smile. Jessica turned around and at the same moment saw Artem in front of her, holding his son's hand. He was standing, and not just standing, but able to move, leaning on a stick as he walked. Jessica almost lost her senses in astonishment. Could Jack have recovered so quickly? The whole thing seemed unreal. About 3 months after these events, Jessica and Jack were married. It was quite modest by local standards, but the newlyweds didn't need more than that, and the most important thing was that they were able to find each other. They lived in a memorable village, where such miracles were rare. The only thing they knew about Eden was that he had finally gone bankrupt and lost everything he had stolen from his late father-in-law. As it happened, it was Jessica who paid off the company's debts and bought the controlling interest at auction for next to nothing. By that time, they were already divorced, and Eden received nothing from this deal. Left penniless, he went under pretty quickly, selling his car and most of his personal belongings along with his jewelry. Kayla's stepmother also got exactly nothing good after the departure of her spouse. All to blame was the lover, who cleaned the stroppy beauty to the thread. But in the village, school made such a good repair that now the occupancy of classes with students has become prohibitive. After all, they were going to them students from all the surrounding villages. Jessica even had to run her own school bus on the route. Roger was extremely happy about it because he had worked in this school most of his life. Looking at the children rushing to school with their backpacks, he thanked Jessica and Jack for giving the village a second life.